All right, talk real quick one more time. Just check it.
Hello, hello, hello. A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
Let me turn you up. Keep talking.
At what point should these two be a concern for a team rank
All right, we're
wise?
good. We're good. We're
Probably don't
good.
need Anti-Stratting and open.
All right, cool, cool, cool. All right, awesome, awesome. All right, all this setting up is done. We're
Nice.
live here. We got Mr. Mahone. Sixth episode of this podcast here, and yeah, we got Mahone here. Pretty well known for his strategic knowledge within the content creating community on CS, and I believe you also said you worked with NiP as an analyst for a while, right?
That's correct. About a year.
Okay. I'm ready to dive into some of that stuff. All right, so starting off with some of your background, just you as a player, when did you start playing CS initially?
Okay, I'm gonna sound old for this, but I probably started playing CS 2009 or something like that. CS Source. Um, I didn't start with Go, so I played CS Source, and I think I was probably like 15 or something at the time. And yeah, that's when I first started playing. And back in those days, like there wasn't matchmaking or like 5v5 or stuff like that. It was literally it's kind of like casual service today where it's like 12v12. But that being said, it was probably like another 6 months later where I started playing 5v5. Like I met some people on the server and they're like, "Yo, you want to scrim with us?" and stuff like that. So I'd say that's how I started, like many, many, many years ago.
Yeah. How many years ago was that exactly?
I don't know what year is it now?
That's
2024, so
2024.
like 15 years ago almost. No,
Damn.
not that long ago. 12, something like that. It's been a while.
How old are you?
I'm 30 now.
Okay. I was about to say, man,
Yeah.
that's like 3/4 of my life right there. That's crazy. Playing CS that long. But I felt like
Yeah.
I started feeling old because I realized I was about to hit my 10-year coin today. I was like, oh shit, like I'm getting up there. The
Yeah.
grades are coming soon, you know.
Yeah.
But
No, you're still young though.
yeah, we're hanging in there.
Yeah.
You said so that's when you started playing CS. When you said you started playing 5v5. Is that like the competitive? Like was that when you started
Yeah.
playing competitively?
Yeah, well, kind of, because I was still young at the time, so like I'd just scrim with people that I knew, and I didn't really play like in leagues and stuff like that because I like my parents, they're stereotypical Asian parents, so they didn't really let me play on the weekdays. And you know
Yeah.
how like with leagues, like back in the day, it was even today still, it's like it's throughout the week, so I couldn't really scrim or play with them, but I would go to LANs. So I went to my first LAN in 2011, and I think I was like 16 or 17 at the time, and yeah, honestly, lines are probably the best thing, or lines are all I did for the first like 2 to 3 years where I competed, quote unquote. And I think at the time I was good enough that people were like, "Yo, you may not be able to play with us for like an actual league, but like for a LAN, we're more than down." I mean, that's how
Hey.
I got started.
So you're just like playing with like random stacks?
No, no, not random stacks. Like there were people who lived in my area. So I lived in Vancouver. So basically all like the West Coast, like Vancouver, BC, like even Seattle sometimes. Whenever there'd be a land during that time, we just stay in contact and be like, hey, Vancouver's coming up. Let's play in it together. And yeah, that's basically, for the first like 3, 4-ish years, it was kind of just going to lands. Wasn't until like when I started university where I actually started playing on ESEA teams. um, I think my very first team, like season 13 or something like that, played on an intermediate team very, very long time ago. And eventually I transitioned into playing for a collegiate team where the appeal of collegiate back then is definitely very different than now, from what I can tell. Because back then it was like you could actually go to lands for collegiate. Like it was the closest thing to feeling like pro without actually being pro,
Yeah.
because like they would pay for you to fly to these events and stuff like that. So I did that all the way up until I graduated essentially. Then after I graduated, I played a little bit more ESCA. I played on a team where eventually we hit MDL, or what's known as ECL today. And uh, when I got to that point, I was already at the late stages of my playing career, I'd say. Like I feel like I was already kind of drained. Our team wasn't doing very well either, and I had just graduated, started a full-time job and stuff like that. So it's just kind of like, you know, after handful of matches and stuff, I was just like, dude, I don't really feel like I can commit the time to really go far, like because the best comparison I have is I remember looking at Modem, right? MOTM.
Yeah.
He was in the league at the same time. And I remember looking at his Steam hours and he had like 120 hours past 2 weeks. And I look at myself and I was like 30 hours and I was
Yeah.
doing everything I could have with like my schedule and like my motivation. So at that point I was just like, I don't really see a point in continuing. And that's when I stopped. And that was probably like 2018.
That's Lovingmama right there.
Yeah. But yeah, it was probably around 2018 where I stopped playing. And that's when I was just like, I just don't feel like competing anymore. I basically dropped CS completely cold turkey. Like I didn't even touch the game anymore at that point.
Yeah. Wait, you were so you weren't playing on a team like the first couple of years. You were just like playing with some friends that you had. Were you
Yeah.
like I mean your content's all about like analytical stuff. Were you always that type of like player, or like did you like play that way like even when you weren't on a team, or did like you pick up on that when you started like on like a
I
set
think
ESCA team?
I'd say that developed more when I was on an ESCA team. Like when I started leading my team. So the teams that I started leading were more like towards the back half of my career. So when I started playing collegiate and when I started playing ESCA, like going into MDL, I'd say that's when I started thinking about the game much more logically and more strategically and stuff like that. When I was younger, I was just a guy who just aimed people all the time.
Yeah.
Essentially, never watched demos, never did any of that stuff. But like towards the end, I would look at demos a little bit more. Still not as much as like if I were to do it again today, I'd probably watch demos way more now. But
Yeah.
back then, it was just like if I felt like it, I'd watch it, and most of the time I'd learn something. But it wasn't something that I was super disciplined about.
Okay. Wait, so you said leading. You said you're a leading team. Were you IGLing your whole
Yeah.
career?
Not my whole career. I'd say probably like 30 to 40% of my career I was an IGL. The other times I was an opper. Sometimes I was more of an anchor player. I feel like I've had experience in almost nearly every role except like the hard entry. I think that was probably the one thing I didn't do where I was just the guy to sacrifice himself. I was never that player, but everything else I've had experience in.
Okay. Did you finish off your career IGLing, or was it like at
Towards
the
the
start
end,
of
no,
the team career?
it was more of like the middle of my career. I was an
Okay.
IGL. When I played in MDL, I was more of an opper, but I was definitely a strong secondary voice. That time or that team at the time, it was if you know Josh RT, he was the IGL of that team at the time. But
Josh Artsy. I
yeah.
can't think of the name. Is he still around
Well,
right now?
he's still around. He's around in Valorant now. He's like
Okay.
the coach for G2. But before back then, if you watched like any rank S or stuff like that or FPL, he was definitely a name that you'd recognize.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, man. Like I'm like so into CS, but I missed out on like the golden era. Like when Tarek and all them were like streaming and shit.
Yeah.
Like I was just playing MM and like team killing my friends at that time. I wasn't like into the comp scene yet. So like,
When did you start CS though?
I started playing I literally know that it was like the beginning of 2015, like the start of that year.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I played for like a couple months because my friend was into it, and then I stopped playing, and then I got back into it because one of my friends like 1v1 me and he beat me, and I was like so mad. I was like, bro, I gotta get good at this game now. So I started grinding, and then I
That's how
really
it
got
starts.
yeah, dude, literally I was so mad, and then I started grinding. I like really started taking it seriously like 2019 ish. So like I missed out like the whole golden era. Like I'll see a lot of people like talk about like all the I don't know Tarek and Freakazoid and all that when they stream. Like I would see like the videos, but I never caught all that stuff live. So
Yeah.
I missed out like that all that whole scene that you were probably a part of. Were you you were playing around that time, or?
I was playing, but I wouldn't really say I was good enough to like be around those guys. And
Okay.
I'd only occasionally watch their streams. Like I was still in college at the time, so I had my hands full with lots of other things too. So
Yeah.
yeah.
What were you in school for?
Civil engineering.
Oh
So
shit.
so like buildings and stuff like that.
Yeah. Did that go and use it all for CS?
For CS,
Yeah.
not in particular, but I mean, I did use the degree for like a year and a half or something like that before, I moved to different jobs and eventually, more into esports and stuff like that. So it wasn't
Okay.
all a waste, but I'd also say, just a quick note, I feel like school did help me probably build more of a logical mind over time, right? Like I think that's just what comes with doing science and math and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So probably helped in that way.
Would you say that's like a big like not, yeah, I guess influence to like your style of calling when you were IGLing, or maybe like your analytics? Like,
Um, I'd say as a player, not so much, or like even like during my playing career, not so much. I think this probably came much more into play after. So like when I started creating my YouTube content and stuff like that, I probably started thinking more in this way, in the sense of like, how does this work logically? Like, what are the fundamentals around this? And, if you're going to explain it to somebody, how do you make it make sense to them? Because you could
yeah,
know something intuitively or just like, in a way where you can't describe it with words, but it's different being able to convey that information to another person in a way that they also understand. So I'd say it helped in that way, but not so much actually playing. I think I was still too young and dumb for that.
so when did the content creation come in? Like, what point in the career was it? After? Was it during? Or
I'd say it was after. So it was after I was done playing. So it was probably around 2019 or so, where I made like a couple of YouTube videos. And the reason being was just like, even though I stopped playing and I retired, um, I still felt that I had a lot of knowledge in my head about how the game could be played and stuff like that. And I think something that really kind of inspired me or maybe made me want to pursue it was like one of my past teammates. His name was Richie. If anyone is still watching this, back then he was we were going over like a demo or something like that, and I was breaking down some stuff that really resonated with him. Like it made sense, and he had said something where he was just like, "Dude, you should start like a YouTube channel or something at some point because like you helped me understand that demo so much." And he said that like years back, and it wasn't until probably like 2 to 3 years later where I actually, you know, that piece of advice that he gave me, like I decided to take action on it. So in 2019, I started just making a handful of videos, and these were just very um, kind of the type of videos that I would have wanted when I was younger or when I was playing. And when I look back at them now, I can't help but kind of cringe and just feel that they just sucked.
yeah,
But at
yeah,
the same time, like when I looked at it, I'm just like, oh, there's actually some good information in here. Even though if I look past all of like the delivery and the way the stuff was edited and stuff like that, um, yeah, I'd say that's kind of how I got started. It was just developing stuff that I wish I had myself as a player, and from there I just continued to make more and more, and essentially um, as more people start to watch it, I started getting more messages, or comments and stuff like that, being like, "Hey, could you make a video about this? Like, I really like the way you explained X, Y, Z." And it was just something where I continued to build it and just continue to get better and better at it to the point where um, like I had people who were playing in like Premiere at that time. I guess it was still called MDL or whatever. Like they would message me and be like, "Yo, your videos are like so good. Like they help me so much. Like we feel like you're the secondary coach that we like don't actually have on our team." Like,
yeah,
and it's surprising to me because when I made these videos, and these are like fairly low quality, I'd say still, like my intended audience were just like people who played open or IM. I thought for sure these would be helpful for these kind of guys, but not for anyone who was like MDL or above. I didn't really think. I thought all this stuff would have been obvious to them.
yeah.
So that's kind of how it started and how it started to progress too.
That must have felt good, man. Like some of like the top like higher up
Yeah.
level players are like complimenting on your videos and stuff. Or
Mhm.
it probably felt good, but did it also make you feel like kind of disappointed? You're like, oh shit, these guys don't know this yet. Like this is my scene right here. Like,
I don't know. I can't say I felt that way. I was definitely surprised when I was just like, oh, okay. It feels like there's like a knowledge gap
yeah,
where there's stuff that I know for some reason that they don't. So um, yeah, I'd say it was probably an interesting experience to even chat with some of these people and just kind of like realize that there are people who reached much higher than I did in the game who are just like, dude, you're telling me stuff that I didn't know, and
yeah,
I just couldn't at the time I just couldn't wrap my brain around it. But that was kind of like the motivation I had to kind of keep making videos and being like, yo, this there's like a higher group of people who actually want this stuff from me, and that was the most surprising.
yeah. I actually, there's a question I have later on that has to do something along the lines of this, but did that like kind of put it into perspective about like these higher level players, like that they aren't like infallible, like like that they're missing out on some things that you thought were like really basic, and that they're learning from you. Like
Mhm.
I touch on this later, but this more has to do with tier 1. But I guess this is like what you're talking about is like tier 2 players, like
Yeah,
MDL and
tier
stuff.
2, yeah, yeah. So I'll get into this a little bit. So with my channel, like at that time, I was getting these people messaging me, but what really kind of took off for my channel was one, guys like Henry G, Launders, James Bardoff, Harry, like the caster, like they all gave shout outs on their Twitters to my YouTube content. They were like, they essentially signal boosted the hell out of out of my channel because I was creating so many good videos at the time, and they're essentially saying like, you got to be watching this. And around that time as well, it's like I started getting messages from actual pro players too,
Oh
who are like,
shit.
who are like, "Yo, your stuff is so good. Like, we watch all of them," type of thing. And
Yo.
it was around that time too. Like I was still working. I was still working my full time job at that time, and when I got those messages, and as I was growing my YouTube channel, I was just like, dude, with this kind of feedback, like I feel like I want to see where it ends up. I want to see where it ends up. Like I want to see, if I just keep working on this for the next like, 6 months to a year, like how far can I go? So I decided, I was just like, I'm gonna leave my job. I'm gonna leave my full time job
Holy shit.
and pursue this YouTube thing to see like where it goes because I've had so much good feedback that I find that like I'd find it hard to believe that there isn't something good that's gonna come out of this. And yeah, so after that happened, I I just continued to make more videos, and that's when I had some teams reaching out to me, and the setup was almost always the same. It was like, "Yo, we've seen your videos. It's like, are you interested in being an analyst for us? We think you're like incredibly smart, and like you can probably do a lot for our teams." And yeah, it's like when I got those kind of messages, and even from players who weren't like trying to get me on their team, like just other pro players who are just messaging me. I was just like, dude, I couldn't believe it. Um, but when that happened, that's essentially over the course of like I think it was only 2 months or so after I left my job. That's when I got to the point where I joined NiP. I think Threat
Damn.
he basically messaged me and he was like, hey, like Rez had seen your videos before, and we really think that you can make a big difference on our team. And it was all just from my YouTube videos. Like, I didn't do anything in terms of like reaching out to these players or teams or anything like that. It was mostly they're reaching out to me, and that's
Yeah.
why I think for anyone who has a YouTube channel or whatever, it's honestly if you're good, it's honestly like your biggest marketing asset because I don't think I would have had all those teams or players reaching out to me um, if I didn't have this YouTube channel, if I didn't make those videos. So that's in short, that's kind of how it happened.
Yeah, that's so you didn't do any like in between NIP. It was just YouTube straight to NIP. Like there was no other
Yeah,
analyst. That's crazy.
yeah.
That's crazy. I would assume that there would have been like some type of in between, but I bro, if I was an NIP, I would have picked you up too, bro. Your videos are like really good. Like
Thank you, thank
actually, I
you.
remember I used to like spam your video. Well, I first off by I started off by spamming Vu videos when I was like really
Yeah,
new to the game, and then
yeah.
a couple launders, and I found you and who's the other guy? He works with Nard a lot. Smirky. He's got some pretty
Mhm.
good
Yeah,
in depth like really niche type videos. I feel
mhm.
like you and Smirky cover like really niche type stuff, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
But yeah, there's like almost like levels to like the target audience of like some of these like CS YouTubers. You're definitely like up there with like
Yeah,
some in depth stuff, you know. Um,
yeah.
but yeah, talking about how like your channel is like really important for marketing. That's literally why I started making YouTube videos. Was because like I always thought IGL tryouts were like just bullshit. Like you try out for a team and you pug, like
Yeah.
Mirage, and they're like, oh, we didn't really like your calls. And it's like, dude, I'm not showing like a 1% of my power, like.
Yeah.
So I made videos to like show like what I know, and it like
Mhm,
makes it easier for people when it comes to like IGLing at least, because that's what they're
mhm.
like looking for. It's like how smart you are
Yeah,
at the game. But yeah, I 100% agree with you. That's crazy how far that brought you with your career. How long did you end up staying with NIP? What was like how long did that
About
last?
a year and like 3 months or so. About a year and 3 months. So I started. I think it was in the middle of COVID. I think I started around September 2020, if I recall. And yeah, so I guess if we kind of just want to talk about what my journey was like in
Yeah, yeah,
NIP. So yeah, I was there for about a year and a half or so, or year and 3 months or so. I started about late 2020, and they had seen my videos and stuff like that. And at first, what they wanted to do was they want to see like how well I anti-strat and stuff like that. Like they knew I could, you know, break down tactics and like scout people and stuff like that. But like in terms of anti-stratting, like what can I do? So there was a bit of like a short trial period where it's just like, okay, can you anti-strat within the time constraint? Because I think that's one of the most difficult things about anti-stratting, or one of the hardest things is, you know, if like can you do it within a reasonable turnaround rate, and is it something that's good? Because if you have a lot of time, I guarantee you almost anybody can do like a good anti-strat, but do it in like the span of like a day or less than a day, in like in that kind of time frame. That's when things get a little bit harder. That's when you kind of have to rely on intuition and rely on, I guess, like using good tools as well. Because like I'm very certain there's no anti-stratter out there, or there's no one who works as an analyst for a team who uses the in-game demo viewer to like anti-strat. Like that's just too
yeah.
slow. So, um, yeah, that's a big thing. And I'd say like anti-stratting is like was is like is probably the one thing that all analysts probably share. I'll say because um, I know that some people probably aren't too aware of like what analysts do, and I'd say that the roles and responsibilities of this analyst or assistant coach or whoever is like secondary to the coach, I'll just say, it can vary a lot depending on the team, and it could vary a lot depending on like what you can offer, I'd say. Um, but I think anti-stratting is the one thing that probably comes in common with basically all of the people in this role, because ultimately the coach needs more time, and the easiest way is to just have a secondary person like look through this stuff. So that was the first thing I did with NIP, was essentially, learn to anti-strat within that short trial period. My stuff was good, so they're just like, okay, yeah, let's do it. Let's bring you on. Because things were still in COVID at the time, I was mostly remote for the first like 6-ish months of my stint with NIP. And during that period of time, I would anti-strat for matches, but I would also like fulfill players' requests in terms of like, say they want to learn more about how to play a certain spot and want to know how other people do it. They'd be like, hey, can you show me like how this guy plays ramp on vertigo? Like I want to see like all the different variations of what teams and players are doing. I want to see like what's meta right now. Other Another type of thing I might do would have been like, say they lose a match or something like that, and they'd be like, hey, what do you think went wrong? Like, give us your
Mm,
perspective of like, what was missed, like what could be done better and stuff like that. So that was like probably the first, I want to say like 3 to 4 months of me being on the team. I didn't really interact with them directly. It's more so just like messages and like just being back and forth. But after a certain period of time, I started dropping in on their practices. I don't remember how it happened, but it's more so just like I got to a point where I wanted to like actually talk to them and understand how they feel as players, and not just on a technical level, but like, are they feeling confident? Like, how do they feel about like their roles on the team and stuff like that? And after I got into that, that's when I really like kind of, it opened my mind to what these pro players kind of what they kind of deal with. So both in terms of like, you know, in terms of the skill set, but also how they kind of interact with each other, and also like their confidence levels and stuff like that. Because at least for me, I kind of thought that pro players were more like almost like what you say, where it's like
yeah.
infallible, where it almost feels like they're perfect, and like, surely, you know, uh small things like wouldn't get to them, and like, attitude issues and all that stuff. But what I learned very quickly was like all these things still exist. I would say the biggest thing is that they just manage it better.
Mm.
So like in North America, I think we, for the most part, it's all very poorly managed. So, we have these guys typing on Twitter and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I'd say, at least in NIP and likely most other teams as well, it's like these same issues come up as well, but it's just not as a big of a deal. It's managed better. And as well, NIP, we also had like a sports psychologist as well. So the sports psychologist, his name was David. He was like an Olympic rower or something like that. And he was very good at being able to kind of get these players on the same page and getting them to express themselves and making sure that they were all good. Um, but essentially, what I'd say is that what I realized very quickly is all the problems that they deal with, or all the problems that we deal with, are the same with them too. It's just that they have better tools to handle it. That being said, when I started working with them, sometimes it'd be like basic things that I felt like they were missing. Like sometimes it'd be like, hey, you're swinging out too wide in this position, because if you look at it from the other player's perspective, like it literally looks like this, right? And then when they see that, they're like, oh, okay, I see. Like I really am swinging wide. And these are sort of these things where it's like you wouldn't realize yourself. And it's not like many people are going to be picking through the demo that closely to be like, these are the small details that are the difference between making the kill or not making the kill, or like a mistake versus not a mistake. So there's a lot of like that kind of stuff that I was working on with them, where especially since we had younger players, like this is like around the time just before we got device, we had younger players. So it's kind of just like, I would try to work with them after practice and stuff like that and just be like, hey, it's like, let's review a demo together, or hey, let's talk about like what we could do a little bit better, or like what's lacking in the game so far in terms of either tactics or mechanics, or maybe even just like an approach, like an attitude type of thing.
Mm.
I can't say I was like the best equipped to like answer stuff about attitude, because at the same time, um, when it comes to comms, I didn't quite understand them at that time because they spoke Swedish, right? And this is
Oh
probably one of the
yeah.
most difficult things, because they spoke Swedish at the time, and I didn't pick up enough Swedish to know. But like, I've been understanding here and there, like the more basic calls and stuff like that. But when it comes to how somebody interacts with another person, is kind of hard to tell. Even if you're, even if you're somebody who knows English like as a second language, it's still hard to pick up like the sarcasm and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So that was definitely something that I didn't really quite have in my toolbox to be able to address. But all those other things were, that's kind of like the work that I did for the first like half of my stint at NIP. It didn't really change until after COVID restrictions started lifting a little bit, where I actually got to go to Sweden, to Stockholm, and I was able to kind of join their boot camps. So essentially, I think I was in Stockholm for like 3 to 4 weeks at a time. I think there were like two main stints I was there. So it's like one from like August to Octoberish, and then the other from like November to Decemberish, or something like that. I was there for the major. I just remember that.
Oh shit.
And during that time, yeah, it was just boot camps are they're very long days, because essentially it's like there's all the theory, and then there's the playing, and then there's the review, and then there's the after prac stuff for the people who still need more individual work. So I'd say it's combination of all those things, and it turned into much more than just anti-stratting by the end of it.
Yeah. That's crazy, man. You actually got to go to Sweden for that job. So
Yeah.
you were when you were doing the remote work before you actually got to go out there, were you like sitting in during practice, or were they just like
So
hitting you up after and like talking after? Like were you there with
so
live matches?
so there was a period of time, I'd say for the majority of time, I wasn't actually there for the practices, but if they were boot camping, I would be. And in my time zone, Vancouver, it's like a 12-hour or 9-hour difference or something like that. So during these like boot camps that they had, I would literally wake up at like 12 a.m. or something like that. So my sleep schedule was like completely flipped, and I woke up at
Yo.
like 12 a.m. and like stayed up with them, um, and all the way until like practice ends. So I basically joined them for the day, but just for me, it's like you know, it was like the midnight to like 10 a.m. type of work day
Yo,
for me, and I go to sleep at like 3 p.m. or something like that. So
that's
it was a
crazy.
very interesting time. It was definitely pretty big toll on my body. It was not like something that I could do, like it's not something I could sustain all the time.
Yeah,
But for those times, it's like I did them because um, there was a purpose behind it. Like when we boot camped, we structured it a bit differently when they brought me on to like actually be on during those times. Like we'd spend a bit more time talking about theory and going over like mistakes and stuff like that because um, I would say one of my strengths was essentially being able to kind of pick out something and to kind of like not necessarily like give them advice on how to play it better, but more so to facilitate a discussion and like to go really deep on it so that, so that by the time we talk about that mistake or address it, it's like we have a very clear plan of like what we fixed. So it could be something like, say you're entering on B Mirage or something like that, and you notice that the spacing is off, or one player goes this way and the other player goes the other way. Stuff that I would talk about is like, hey, it's like when we enter here, it's like, should we have some rules behind like how we do it? Like, should the second player follow the first player? Or like, what should the spacing be behind them? What should the first player be looking at while the second player, or what does the second player look at while the first player looks at? It's these kind of like smaller things that I'll just constantly adjust with them. And, if they had a good solution, then maybe we'd just say, okay, yeah, that's actually pretty good. Let's just do that. If they didn't have one, then I'd offer my own. But that was something I felt that I was pretty particularly good at in terms of just being able to kind of facilitate and spot, hard to spot mistakes and be able to kind of come up with a better solution as a result of it.
that's gotta be so beneficial for like to have someone like you on a team. Like, I, I'm sure like only the top teams can probably like actually afford analysts and stuff, right? Is that what? Do you think that per kind of like adds to, like the difference between like like a tier two and a tier one team is like the ability to like have a big staff like that? Do you think that really makes that much of a difference?
Um, I think it definitely helps. Like it doesn't hurt, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But I think how much impact you have really depends on like the system behind like what that support staff does, because I could easily see some teams where it's like they have the support staff but the players still ultimately kind of run the show in terms of like how they want the team to operate and how they want to
Mm,
iterate.
yeah.
I'd say in NIP's case, in our case during this time, we were quite fortunate where it was the three of us. So it was me, Threat, and David, our performance coach, where we essentially created the system of like where we were very intentional about how we structured our days. We were very intentional about how we, do the theory stuff. We were very intentional about how we did reviews and stuff like that. Where essentially the whole team bought into to the way that we were doing things because it was very, what do you call it? It was thought out. I think that's the
Yeah, yeah.
biggest difference. It was thought out because, I won't say that we had like the best system out there, like because it's hard to know what other teams are operating under. But at the very minimum, we could say that it was thought out and it wasn't just lackadaisical. Like it wasn't just like we're just trying this just cause. It's like we had reasons behind what we were doing.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's probably more has to do with like the players and how bad they want the staff than just the fact that the staff is there.
Yeah,
If they're gonna like actually utilize them correctly.
yeah.
Talking about utilizing it, you're mentioning anti-stratting, and this is something I've always wanted to talk to someone about because like
Yeah.
I've never had someone experienced in it, and so NIP picked you up specifically for anti-stratting. Were you
I would I was
used
gonna
to?
say,
Oh yeah, yeah.
go ahead. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, were you used to anti-stratting before being picked up, or was this like a new concept to you, and then you had to like learn it for the job?
To me, it was largely a new concept. Like I had done some anti-stratting before as a player, but it was honestly when I look back, it's it was like pretty basic stuff, and it was attuned for the level of play that it was. Right, it could just be as simple as like, oh, they rush B a lot, or they rush B on the first gun round, type of stuff. Like that's easy stuff. But it was definitely like a learned skill for me. I think the biggest thing was just understanding what is valuable to the players and the team, and this kind of comes down to understanding how your team plays too. Fortunately for me, I'd say that fundamentally I had a pretty good idea of like how they thought about situations and like how they play just from watching the way that they do stuff. So it was kind of it wasn't too hard for me to kind of know what the right reads were. The difficult part was more so how do I do that fast? Because
Mm.
it's without extra programs like today we have Gnosis and other stuff like even CS:GO overview stuff like this helps anti-stratting a lot. But if you're kind of going in and just like trying to use in-game demo player, that's it's gonna be incredibly tough to do that. I
Yeah.
think I think for me it was understanding how to use these tools that exist out there as fast as possible and to kind of develop a system around like what's actually important in terms of like even if I look back, even let's just say we play against FaZe in 2 days or 1 day, it's like how many demos do I look back on them? Like, am I just gonna look at the last two, the last three, the last five, the last 10? Like, which ones actually matter? And after a period of time, I realized that the sweet spot is really like 2 to 3, because at tier one, teams tend to kind of change the way they play, or like they always evolve, and like some of their reads are going to change. So being able to just kind of spot like where like what that good sample size is was something that I learned. The second thing was kind of trying to understand what I wanted the team to do with my reads.
Mm.
So some analysts that I've heard of or have been in contact with, I'd say a very beginner mistake is to essentially try to give the players all the information, because that's a very bad idea. All you'll do is just overload them, and most of the time they're probably just not going to look at it that carefully, and most of your work is just going to go to waste. I think the biggest thing that I learned as well was essentially simplifying it down to like 2, 3, maybe even 4 like very key reads where it's just like if this happens, you're going to win the round as long as you spot this. I think that was a very key detail for me, because when I first started, I think I tried to do too much of like, this is everything. But at the end of the day, what the players really need is just when they see a very certain situation, they need to know how they should react. And these situations will generally be stuff where it's like it's gonna go against their intuition. So for example, it might be something like one read that you might have is on Inferno. Say a team has an A execute where they'd like to smoke Arch, they like to smoke Library, and then they like to wrap or something like that. And like they normally like to wrap Arch. Say that's like the default read that you have, but you notice the team that when they throw those smokes, they actually send 3 out halls. That is a very key detail, because most of the time when you see those smokes, you're going to expect an arch wrap, not an A pop, or not like A halls pop. So that's when you tell your team like, hey, when you see those smokes, they're actually going to go for a halls pop. So set up for that instead. Even though that's very like counterintuitive to like how most teams generally play. So I'd say those are probably the key things where when you're anti-stratting, you want to do things or you want to convey things that are going to help your players or guide your players to the right decision, to ensure that they actually make that correct decision, because there's so many factors where they might make the wrong one. You want to make sure that what you tell them is going to guide them to the right one.
Yeah. Okay, man. I got so many questions. I feel like I have to write some of this stuff down because I got questions coming up as you're talking.
Yeah.
All right. So the first one I wanted to ask, you mentioned here. I just lost it now. Okay, we'll go to another one. What? So one of them. Yeah, so the first one that came up was actually the system. So you said you developed a system for anti-stratting. Are you able to like reveal this, or is this like some top secret NiP like contract you signed type stuff that you can't discuss?
Okay, so I can't go into like super detail of like what the reads. Actually, no. I'll say this. I can reveal as much as I can through conversation, but I'm not going to show any documents or
Okay,
anything
okay,
like that.
okay.
So system, at least for me, the system that I had was essentially the two main things. So the first thing was try to figure out what if there's anything that indicates what the T's are going to do. So I'd say anti-stratting on T side is more important than CT side. Or like to make that more clear, as in when you're on CT side, you want to know more of what the T's are doing as opposed to vice versa. And that's because when you're a T, it depends on how your team operates. In some cases, you might not care that much about how they like run their CT sides. You might just want to know like, hey, if they have like some weird funky setup, that you should be aware of it. But you might not want all the details of like how they rotate and all that stuff. You're mostly going to essentially have a game plan that you built yourself and just adjust it based on these small CT side things. On the T side though, or when you're on CT side and you're fighting their T side, as for me, at least at tier one, the biggest thing is that you'd have to understand that these teams play against each other a lot. There's essentially a sort of meta that develops between these teams. It may not be like a direct meta, but more so like most teams at this skill level tend to throw these smokes, or they tend to throw these molotovs, or they tend to use these type of timings. And as long as you understand that most teams kind of have that fundamental image already, the key thing is to try to find those teams on certain maps where they don't follow that same structure, where it's like, let's just say for example on Inferno B, say most teams like to throw the spool smoke and the CT smoke and then the flash and they go in, right? But let's just say this is one team where all they do is just throw a flash and then they throw the smoke on the run. That's a pretty key piece of information for your B players to be like, you know, you shouldn't be expecting those smokes to be coming over to tell you when the B pop is coming. It could be happening at any moment. So, maybe have a guy that plays anti-flash, or maybe have a guy who's ready with a Molotov out or something like that. These are like the kind of adjustments that you might want to be aware of. And as well, another smaller detail might be like, say on Nuke, everybody throws outside wall smokes, right? But which kinds does the team that you're facing, which ones do they throw the most? Like, do they throw the diagonal ones the most? Do they throw the standard wall ones? And is there anything that those smokes will tell you about where they're going to go? Because there's some teams where they may throw the diagonal wall smoke, but then they don't actually send anybody down secret. And if you identify that, then it means that you don't actually have to rotate a guy down. Vice versa, you might meet a team where they throw those diagonal smokes, and then they actually send like the entire team down. Then for sure you're going to want to have a big rotation. So it's kind of just finding these like mega reads where essentially it's going to just allow your team to make the better decision or the correct decision more often than not. I'd say that's kind of what I distill my system under. It's not that complicated, because I personally don't think it's that complicated, but it's just one of those things where as long as that's your goal on what you're doing, I think that's kind of how I operate.
Did you use any tools for this? You mentioned like two at the start.
Yeah. So the first one I'd say is Gnosis. That's probably the best at doing anti-stratting and stuff like that. That being said, that's more. I will say that in today's age, people are using something called Skybox Edge now. I've only had a little bit of experience on how that actually works, but for most teams that are not tier one, you're probably going to be using Gnosis, and that's a great tool for being able to spot like these patterns, because it'll show you heat maps of like where players like to go. It'll show you what grenades they throw and stuff like that, and it's very easy to essentially cross-reference what happens when somebody throws a smoke, because there are times where two people, they throw the same nade, but they throw it in different ways. And if you can tell when one player throws that nade versus when another player throws that nade, it'll actually tell you what's about to happen. So the best example I can give is probably overpass B. Everybody throws that B short Molotov, right? Or that B short Molotov typically happens. And it's usually thrown by the B player. But sometimes some teams, they have another player throw that B Molotov and they throw it a different way. And typically when that happens, it usually suggests that they're going to go B, or they're going to do something very special in particular, because it just means that it's not their default. So that's when these like smaller kind of tells, like they're much easier to spot in Gnosis, I'd say.
So yeah, I can imagine like if you're, I don't know, like on A site Mirage or something, and you see like a jungle smoke come from like the mid area instead of like over A main, you're like, oh, something's up here. Like that might be obvious even if you didn't do anti-strat work, but like some shit like that is like what you're talking about, like different directions, like where the smoke is coming from. Exactly. Sure, that's interesting. Yeah, because
I mean, I was just gonna say, and it's not just excluded. It's not just smokes. It's also flashes and Molotovs. Like the way somebody throws a flash, or maybe even if they don't throw a flash, like that tells you a lot about what they may or may not do. Even this even goes down, or this even comes down to just like player positioning. I remember, I remember there was a read that I did one time on a team where, you know how on most defaults on a Mirage, or most defaults on Mirage, there's one player at A, 2 to 3 players mid, and then one player like underpass B, like that area, right? Most of the time, you're expecting that there's only one lurker A. I remember there was one time I found a read where at a certain point in the round, like at 125 or something like that, the A player ends up leaving Palace to go B. And if we could find, or if in the middle of the round, if we could spot when that happens, then we'd be able to know for sure that they're going towards B. Because this is one of those reads where it's like it's one of those reads where you have to take a bit of a risk to find out. Because if you don't take that risk, you're always going to feel like, oh, it could be A or it could be A. But if you just take the slight little risk of, okay, we're going to push into Palace at 125. If he's not there, it means it's 100% B. Whereas vice versa, if you don't, then you're just kind of just stuck in this, playing default thing. So it's these kind of reads that like will help teams win rounds out of nowhere. And sometimes like whenever you see top teams where it's like it feels like they make like some kind of weird move or weird over rotation, it could be because of reads like this where somebody on the
Yeah,
support staff found something where it's just like this is exactly what's happening.
that's fuck, man, dude. That like I've never thought about like looking into stuff like that when it comes to like calling, and the fact that like you have like people dedicated to do that. Like, oh, I wonder like how different like it's really got to be to like be on those pro teams. Like, just like
Yeah.
you're doing like quote unquote wrong things if you didn't have the
Mhm.
information, but since you have the information,
Yes.
it's the right thing.
Yes,
And
exactly.
that was one thing I was gonna ask is so like I've always heard about conditioning, right? Like how
Mhm.
important conditioning is. And I feel like at the level I play at, like that conditioning can only be done within that one game. So like when you're saying like, oh, this team throws slash smokes and they never go down with it, is the
Mhm.
conditioning at the pro level being done over the course of several games where like we played this team last tournament, we played this team like a week ago in Pro League, we played this team and they're like they did this last time. So like are teams like going into like matches like thinking about like how they played against another team and how the other team played against them like recently with that type of conditioning in mind instead of like only the conditioning done in that game itself? Is it like more of a like a long? Does that make sense? What I'm trying to
Yeah.
ask?
Yeah. I definitely think so because whenever you whenever you play against a team after like a short period of time, it could even just be the span of like a weekend or like one tournament after another. There's always like a certain mind game. And I'd say that for the most part, it's like whenever we get into those kind of matches, I've always kind of just thought of it as, okay, this is what they did last time, but be aware that they can change because they know what they've done against us recently. And at the same
Yeah.
time, we're aware of that too, of all the things that we did against them. So I'd say more than anything, this is probably on the IGL to figure out like how he wants to play with this. I'd say for like the coaches and like the support staff, for them to have like direct input on this is a little tough. It kind of depends more on like the IGL, like how they want to call, how they're seeing the game, because ultimately they're the ones that are feeling it, right? Like they're the ones that are like they're the ones that can feel like whether something feels off. So for example, like we may have a read from the previous game and maybe our game plan is to see, is that read still valid? Like maybe
Mm.
we'll just be like, okay, they throw these wall smokes outside all the time. Maybe, first couple gun rounds, we're gonna send a guy like aggressive outside to see, like, hey, is this read still valid? And if it is, then okay, then we realize that this game could be could be being played the same way. But if we see that it's not, then that signals to the rest of the team like, hey, we're playing against a slightly different team this time, so just be more aware of everything. So yeah, definitely mind games, and in terms of like very specific preparation for it, I'd say not a ton, just because I feel if you get to a point where you're just like mind gaming yourself out of like all these different scenarios where you kind of like overthink things, you don't want to get to that point. But I think you just want to be aware of like what you've done and what the other team has done and just leave it at that, but not build like an entire game plan around it.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
The other thing I was gonna ask too is like I'm assuming that anti-stratting also changes as like the levels go up in play. Like
Mhm.
what are some like valid things that you can do at like a lower level in terms of anti-stratting that you can't do at a high level? So like I guess like one example, like I would like I never like watched the demo, but like I played against a team and played against them again, and like at the lower level, most people only have like one style of play. Like they're
Yep.
always in like a kill ball, or they're always like split up. And I learned
Mhm.
like, okay, if I can identify like the team how they play, like numbers wise, it's pretty easy to beat them the following game because like we can do things to
Yeah.
counter those specific plays. But like as the levels get up, I'm assuming like you're also counter anti-stratting when you play, so you're like hiding this information. So like what I think I'm getting into two different questions. All right, so the first one is what things can you do at a lower level in terms of anti-stratting that someone can use at like the main to like I don't know, maybe low
Yeah.
advanced that you can't do at the pro
Mhm.
level, and what are some things at the pro level that you do in terms of anti-stratting that you can't do at the lower level?
Okay. So I think first question in terms of at the lower level, I think so I'm just gonna draw from my own experience in terms of like back when I played at the lower levels. So first thing is people like to run the same pistols a lot. I'd almost say that this is sometimes the case at pro level too.
Oh, really?
So just checking like what pistols people run all the time, that's probably going to be a huge one. I wouldn't be surprised if you already do that. The
Were you
second
in
thing,
sorry to cut you off. You just
yeah,
brought back a memory. I think we had like the same CT pistol on Inferno for 2 years. We never did anything else.
yeah,
And it would work.
exactly,
You know?
exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the thing as well about anti-stratting. Like, even though you may know about what the other team is doing, doesn't mean you can stop it. But
Yeah.
that being said, that's just a fact for some teams where they run the same pistols. So that's probably the first thing. Second thing at a lower level is that I'm back then, I imagine there were a lot of teams that had like very set rounds where they didn't do very much to kind of condition the fact that they're doing those set rounds. I'd almost just say like I'd almost just say if you're at a lower level and you actually want to anti-strat, just load in like their past 3 demos or whatever, and just look for every round that's not a default. Like every
Mm.
round that looks like it's something unique. Note all those down. If they do them in at least 2 of those games, like 2 separate games, then like that's something where you should just be like, okay, we should expect this strat in our game coming up.
That
So that's
Yeah,
that's another one.
to comment on that, that's really interesting because I think I picked up on that like without anti-stratting, but like just in the game where like
Mhm.
I don't know, like I'm the B player in Inferno, and like let's say they always molly car every round, and then one round they throw a half wall smoke. I'm like,
Yeah.
these fuckers they're gonna abs pop, dude. Like this is so obvious. They've never thrown
Yeah,
this
yeah,
smoke before. They're trying to buy time.
yeah,
Like that's
yeah.
interesting you say that. So I think I picked up on that intuitively, but I'm assuming you
Mhm.
can find way more if you were to watch a demo like you're saying
Yeah,
of like
yeah.
just a random change of pace that they
Mhm.
never set up for. You
Yeah,
can
yeah.
easily counter that.
I'd say almost any of those are probably the easiest ones. Like anything where it's just like it's not their default. Like it'd be so easy to spot in a demo, I'd say. So pistol rounds, I said. Um, Unique gun rounds. I think the third one might be a bit more. Um, I wouldn't expect a lower team to necessarily do this, but like an easy one would just be how do they fight for the most important part of the map? So, for example, Infernal Banana or Vertigo A ramp, like what smokes do they use? What mollies do they use? Because if you can figure out when they're fighting it versus when they're not, like that's just easy at that point.
Yeah.
Like, because then you'll see that's like, oh, when they throw like all these flashes in the smoke with the Molotov, like, oh, they're definitely fighting it. How you decide to react off of it, that's up to you. But just being able to see like when they do that stuff and how they do it, I think reveals a lot about how like where the round is going essentially. So I'd probably say those are essentially the easiest ones. I think another one that's probably pretty helpful that's used at the pro level as well is just very simple, just who plays what position. I know back in my day, I definitely didn't do that, and it probably would have helped a lot. So even just like a quick, whoever the IGL is of the lower level team, just go through the demos very quickly and just see like who's their B player, who's their rotate player, who's the A rotate, like who's their anchors. Because as soon as you kind of know like who those are, like you'll be able to get so much more space than than you'll have otherwise. Because otherwise, if you don't have that information, you're always kind of guessing whenever you're pushing into
Yeah.
a bomb site as to whether that's the second player or the first player or the third player or whatever. If you know who's playing which site and where they're supposed to be, that helps a lot as well.
Yeah, I've never thought to do that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, like if you're going into like a site and you kill a B player that's normally not there, you're like, oh shit, they probably have
Yeah, yeah,
information. Or that it's
exactly.
like an anti-eco, you're like, oh, they're probably stacked. Like
Yeah.
that's crazy. Yeah, I don't know how I never thought to do that. That makes a lot of sense.
Don't worry, I didn't think of doing that back then either. But
Yeah.
that the player position one is probably like it's the easiest one that all the pro teams do. I think. Like I'd say even if you're tier 2, like just knowing where people play, it helps so much.
Okay. And then what's the vice versa of that then? So like what are some things that you do at the pro level that you just can't do at the lower level in terms of like anti-stratting?
So I'd say at tier 1, the biggest difference is that at tier 1, like, and I'm talking about where the phases, vitalities, like those type of teams play, is that it's hard to anti-strat them because the way they play is so concealed at times where it's hard to know like what the tells are, and like the reads are just so much harder. And as well, the big thing is because they know they're getting anti-stratted. That's the
Yeah.
difference. They know they're getting anti-stratted. So in a way, they're kind of crafting the way they play to be a little bit less readable, because there are definitely teams at the tier 2, tier 1 level who are like kind of transitioning, where these tier 2 teams, because they play so many officials and because like, the structure isn't as developed when it comes to the anti-strat meta, um, it's like they're used to not getting anti-stratted. And then as soon as they go to tier 1, maybe they have like one, big tournament or something like that. But then afterwards, they kind of fizzle out because teams know how to anti-strat them and they're not used to getting anti-stratted themselves. So I'd say that's probably the biggest thing, where it's like it's a lot harder to anti-strat at tier 1. And I'd say a good portion of my reads on those type of teams, I'd say are reads that they are not even aware of themselves. It might be stuff like they never throw a flash when they go up mid on Inferno, and when they don't do that, it basically signals that they're gonna go, B or A or whatever. It's these like very, very small things, or maybe even something like the guy always extinguishes the Molotov of banana, and when he does that, it means that like there's 2 or 3 guys behind him. It's like these very small details at tier 1 that, I'd say are, that you can actually, do something with. Whereas like the tier 2 teams, they haven't necessarily thought like this far. Like I know there's definitely some teams where, they're on the rise, and it's like, for example, on Nuke, it's like they have 3 different types of smoke walls, and like every single smoke wall they have, like it always means one particular thing. Those type of teams do exist in tier 2, and they're like the easiest to anti-strat.
Mm.
And I'll say this is one piece of advice when it comes to anti-stratting that I got from Device. I'm not afraid to say it, but the big thing for him was, when you play against those tier 2 teams as a tier 1 team, you should always anti-strat the hell out of them, because they're not used to getting anti-stratted. And as soon as you anti-strat them like in the middle of the game, they're not going to know how to adapt because they've never
Yeah.
felt that way before. So I'd say that's probably the biggest difference between tier 1 and tier 2. The tier 1 teams know they're getting anti-stratted and they know how to handle it.
Yeah, you probably like totally throw them off their game. They're like, "Oh shit, I don't know
Yeah,
what they know about us
exactly.
anymore. I don't want to call this no more." Like,
Yeah.
what the other thing I was gonna say too about that. So like, would you say like the tier 1 level, their like defaults and stuff? Their defaults are they sacrifice like efficiency and like I don't know. Let's say like yeah, being efficient with, like utility and like timings for concealment of what they're actually doing. Like, would you say that that's probably what happens? Like, they maybe throw extra flashes or extra smokes at the start of the round to truly hide what they're doing versus being like extra efficient. Does that make sense?
I know what you mean. I don't know if that's necessarily what they do. I feel like what tier 1 teams are really good at doing is building contingencies around the map, like, having lurkers so that in case anything goes wrong or anything kind of feels off, they have a backup plan. Where essentially, let's just say you're coming up banana on T side. You're coming up banana on T side, and then you're noticing that like, oh, a ton of people or a ton of CTs are throwing like nades at you and stuff like that. But being able to have like that second guy who's like towards alt mid or like towards apps or whatever, so that you can swing the rotation back towards A, I think that's what tier 1 teams are really good at doing. And they're able to do that in like really chaotic situations. The situation I gave you just now is a very simple one, but like,
Uh,
just think about like your most chaotic, like 3-on-3, 3-on-4s, where, it's not very clear what the next play is, but they make it clear by having a guy on the other end of the map that can kind of help that can kind of essentially help swing the round back around. So I'd say that's probably another thing where, even if you're getting anti-stratted, as soon as you feel that the other team has the read on you, like let's just say they throw one more Molotov than you expect or one more nade than you expect, that's when having that contingency player on the other side of the map will help, because it's like, okay, we're running into a stack, let's go back. And as soon as you start doing this type of stuff, then the other team will start knowing about it too. And then, that's when this whole mind game begins to play, where it's just like, you don't want to give up your stack. You want to make sure that they run into it. So that way, your game plan isn't given up.
Yeah.
I'd say that's probably the best way to describe it.
How else? Well, then, if they're not like using more Util, how else are they like concealing? There's like how are they like counter anti-stratting? Like, because I would assume like if you're counter anti-stratting, you're probably throwing more stuff to like feign whatever you do on other rounds.
It's actually the opposite.
So they actually throw less overall.
I think they throw less. They actually throw less, because by throwing less, you have more control over when you're actually throwing it or not. So another example would be, Inferno T side, when you're that person coming up alt mid and you Molotov the window, right? If you do that less, then it becomes a bit harder for the CTs to read like when you're actually there or not. Because if you throw that every single time that you're there, it's very easy to read. But if you don't throw it every time that you're there, then it's a guessing game for the CTs. It's like he might be there, he might not be. So I'd say that's probably more of what it is. Essentially less, but at the same time, there's probably going to be moments where it's like they may throw one extra flash at a spot where it's not typically, right? And then they'll send the guy back. So I'd say it's almost just this like weird allocation where it's like maybe you don't throw something here, but you throw something here instead to try to make it less clear. But I would say probably the more of the default is to throw less, because then you just have that piece of the utility for the rest of the round. It's harder for the other team to kind of read. Yeah.
That's really interesting, because I always like thought in my head, I'm like, because I never knew about counter anti-stratting. I've never had to like deal with that yet in main, but like I always assume that they would like throw more to like totally prevent like any type of information gathering. But what you're saying, so yeah, I was assuming that they would sacrifice utility and efficiency with utility to prevent anti-stratting, but they actually sacrifice like maybe like the assistance of utility, so they actually just save their utility and make it's probably like a bit riskier in terms of like taking the duels itself, because you're not like fully secured in some types of like map control takes, but like that saves you from the anti. Am I describing
you're
that?
making sense.
Okay.
Yeah, you're making sense. It's basically by not throwing or by not masking it by just throwing utility, you have more opportunities in like the middle of the late round to actually do stuff with it. Because if you're the type of team that, if you're trying to mask everything all the time, you're using all of your utility to do that, it means that like your actual sight hits are just going to be weak.
Yeah.
And this is a problem that I'd say even teams like NiP at the time ran into, where it's just like, it's like, oh, we're trying to take all this map control on overpass, but now we don't have a smoke anymore, because we already spent it doing this, we already spent it doing this, we already spent it doing this. So yeah, I'd say the default is probably, like I said, to save it, so that way you can use it in other parts of the round. And there's other ways to kind of condition teams as well. Like you can condition it like with your player model. Like you can maybe do like a jiggle peek or something like that, or like some sort of jump spot or anything that kind of shows that you're there without actually having to use utility. Another way as well is to just kind of double up with like two people, try to go for a trade before like you get to the part where you like actually have to use utility. So there's ways around it, I'll say.
Holy shit, bro. You're blowing my brain right now, because like that was the problem I was coming into, especially on overpass, where I'm like, I gotta conceal what's going on at A. You got to like A conditioning stuff, then B conditioning stuff, and then like the end of the round happens. I'm like, I gotta execute with like fucking one smoke and a flash. It's like, oh, there goes that. The team like never challenged us during like the default. We got a 5v5 execute, like barely any util. That makes a lot of sense too. So yeah, you would probably want to save more utility, because like you're still conditioning stuff by not doing things, and so they're like unexpected, and you could make up for like that conditioning, like what you said, was like jump spots and peaks, and even just going for duels. Like which that is something like I think I was pretty bad at like when it came to like my IGLing was like I was all about like map control and like this is how you take this side of the map, this is how you take it, and like conditioning based around utility. But like you can just get rid of that and just kill someone, sometimes. Or like that just the duel itself is the conditioning. That's really interesting.
I'd say as well that it's another way to kind of keep the other team on their toes. I'd say especially at lower levels when it's like, at least back when I played at this level too, it was kind of like it always felt like teams broke down into certain categories. There's the teams that are like they always use utility before taking map control and stuff like that. And then there's the teams that like they just run at you basically, right? But being able to kind of combine those two and to essentially keep your opponents on their toes where it's like they're not really sure whether they're going to get mollied out or if they're just going to get swung on with a trader. Like that helps to kind of keep the other team on their toes so that whenever you do something, even if you don't have the utility for it, like even if you don't have money for it, let's say, like you have a way of taking that area of the map and you're not so reliant on, okay, we got to have this before we do this. And I think just being able to kind of get your team more comfortable with those types of realities, I'll say, is probably like the best way forward.
Yeah, I definitely would say I was like one of those like util teams because I noticed these categories too, where it's like these guys are util heavy. Oh, these guys are dry. Like they're always just dry peeking stuff. And like I started like combining the differences, but that was still based off of reads. Where I'm like, hey, let's just start doing more context. They can't opt this round, but it's still probably good to contact, even if they can opt if you have other information around that.
Yeah.
And then you're also saying too, like keep them on their toes. So like when it comes to like switching up, like how you play, I guess like mid round or even I'm out of focus, or even at like the start of the game, is there? This is something I was always curious into. And Michelle, she said that she's like worked with some like high level teams and they've implemented some kind of stuff like that. Was there ever any like type of like in your system built-in RNG where like, oh, it's a Wednesday, so we're not doing this mid take. You know what I'm saying? Like to make it still random, or like or like I don't know. Like you look at the clock and it's like 7:47. You're like, oh, that means that every time we get to like this part of the default, we do this map take instead. So it's like there's built-in RNG because there's like what I've realized when watching demos is that there's so many fucking ways to take like one part of the map, and they're all like equally valid. Like some of them are like have definite advantages over others where it's like, oh, this one is a cheap way to take it where you're saving util. This one's like a super safe way to take it where you're throwing a lot of util. But I also noticed that there was a bunch of different map control takes where essentially the same amount of util was being thrown. It was just different. That's all it was. It was just different. And it's like, do you implement like these just different map control takes to maintain this like secrecy of how you're playing? And when you implement this, is there like an RNG element within your system when you do something like that?
Okay, so
that's a big ass question.
Like
Sorry.
No. So in terms of like actual RNG, like what you're talking about with like the day of the week or like the time, like I can't say I've really ever experienced that.
Yeah.
Although it's not the first time that I've heard about that too.
Oh,
I've
really?
heard about that concept before. But no, for the most part, I think it's the way to kind of think about it, or at least the way I've been exposed to it is essentially think about what your most important pieces of utility are. So let's just say we're talking more about like ways to do stuff, right? Or like that kind of thing. I'd say it's probably more down to like before you take any area of the map, like you want to essentially see like what resources you have. So you never want to get to a point like let's just say you're taking overpass A and you always want to jump up smoke when you go towards A. It basically just means that everything you do before that point, you need to make sure you have that smoke by the end of it. So there is going to be a lot of improvisation because let's just say the only thing you have in that round is just that smoke, but you need that smoke to actually hit A. So that means like, when you take long or when you come up connector or whatever, you're not going to have the mollies and you're not going to have the flashes and stuff like that. So everything is going to look a little bit different when you take it all the way to the point of when you actually throw that smoke. At the same time, if you have all the utility that you could want, then you could essentially kind of figure out or like kind of piece together where you could use stuff. So now is the time where you Molotov connector, maybe you do both the mollies, and then maybe at long you actually do throw that flash, or maybe you do the run boost because you want that flash instead for the long bathrooms. But at the end of the day, you're still ending with that smoke for jump up at the end. So I don't really want to say it's kind of like down to RNG, but it's more so kind of seeing what resources you have and just assessing like how important is it that I actually throw this at this time, or is it something that I should save, or is it something that's like critical to the round where it's like no matter what I have to keep this till the end because otherwise there's no other way to do it. Um, so that's when kind of having like a playbook of ways you take stuff, like whether it be off a flash or off a Molotov or off, even just like your movement and like the way you peek stuff. This is where it all comes in handy because, Counter Strike is a very complicated game and no two situations are exactly the same. They can be very similar, but this is when kind of like having all those different types of ways of taking stuff, that's when it comes in handy.
Okay, and you would say that like just having this like hierarchy of like importance of like the map control, like which
Yeah.
one to do. Having just the variability and just that alone is like it's random enough that it's hard to read. Like you don't have to have because like the way I always like I had stuff like that where it's like different ways to take map control based off different reasons and like
Mhm.
there was certain advantages. But I was wondering if I ever got to like the higher level, like will I have to have just different ones just to have different ones and then add some type of RNG factor. But what you're saying is that like just that hierarchy alone might be enough to keep you unreadable, would you say?
I I think so to a reasonable level. I'd say to a reasonable level in the sense that, of course, if it's just based on your economy, I'll say if it's just based on your economy and like, every time you do have the Molotov, you always throw it, then in that case, then you're being maybe slightly too readable. But over the course of like a game where let's just say you scrim, let's just say you do a full scrim of like 4 scrims in a day and all you did was just play the same map, right? I guarantee that you're probably going to have run into different economic situations. In each of those economic situations, you had to find a different way to take an area of the map that didn't involve using the same thing every time.
Yeah.
That's where I think like if you can recognize each of those moments and like that's when you start to realize like, oh, you actually have a lot of options in the way that you can do this stuff. Like for example, um, like on Infernal Banana, a lot of people like to throw the half wall flash when they're crossing that car area. But like you don't necessarily have to. You could have a guy boost on top of the wall and then peek it, or maybe you could have the guy just jump spot the half wall angle first to see if there's anybody playing it and then peek it, or maybe you do a combination of all those things and then you flash. That's where like all the mixing and matching comes into play, and I feel like as long as you're paying attention to all that stuff and you have it in your mind or written down of like all these different variations, like I think it'll just come fairly naturally.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I mean, maybe to my teammates, I don't know. I've always had like a super like analytical mind where it's like I have to do the right play at the right time. And like
Mhm,
I'm not doing this call unless I have a read. Like, like I'm
mhm,
not doing this map control take unless I have the hard read. And if not,
yeah,
then we're doing the safe one, you know?
mhm.
But yeah, I guess what you're saying makes sense. Like it's probably variable.
I,
It
I think
varies enough.
I think something that helped me, at least in my younger days, was that there's multiple ways to win around. There's not always one way. And I think, at least to me, that was a mind opener because in some way I feel like I was kind of like you, where it's just like, oh, it's got to be done like this way or this way. Well, I mean, CS is one of those games where things will mess up. Like somebody's gonna get a kill where they shouldn't. Somebody's gonna miss a flash when they shouldn't. Somebody's gonna, there's stuff that happens. But I think at the end of the day, just understanding that just because something doesn't go your way doesn't mean that the round is lost. And I think that's something at least tier one or most of the pro scene has gotten a lot better about in the past 3 days. Not 3 days, 3 years, 3 years, where it's just like there's so much more willing to cancel than they used to be. Because I
Yeah.
know back then it's almost just like this is the strat. It's either gonna work or it's not. But nowadays it's like teams are quick to cancel when things don't go right. Like if the
Mm.
smoke gets missed, somebody dies early, all that stuff. Like that's I think that's just kind of like I'd almost just say like a fundamental at this point.
Yeah. To be able to like recover from like a bad like start of the round or something. It's funny you say that about how you're like you'd get mad if it didn't go the right way, because I remember like I would low-key get mad if like my teammates got a kill like when they weren't supposed to, because I had some crazy game plan. I'm like, dude, you just fucked it. Like I was about to have some crazy strat call, and now we just won the round because you got a 2K. Like what the fuck, man? Like, but yeah, that's interesting. That's something like when I end up joining a team that would definitely be very beneficial. Is like being able to cancel stuff just like and just accept the fact that you just on a loss that utility or map control whatever, and have confidence in like your ways of recovering. That's a whole other aspect of the game I didn't even like think about like in terms of improving. Wow. Dude, that's crazy. All right, this is kind of getting into like another question that I have, because all these are like aspects of the game I've never even thought about. What is like the difference between like tier 2 and tier 1? Was it just that system of like anti-stratting and counter anti-stratting that you mentioned before, or is there like way more that like is just unspoken?
Okay, so I think this is a really hard question.
Okay.
First off, it's actually a very hard question. I don't think anybody will give you like the same answers, but to me, I just think that tier 1 in general is just a little bit better at basically everything. I feel like they're just 10 to 15% better at everything. The individual players that are on tier 1 teams, the systems that they have at tier 1, the confidence that they have at tier 1, the way that they recover from like, bad situations. To me, they're all just 10 to 15% better. And when you combine all those aspects together, it's like there's a clear distinction.
Yeah.
That being said, the reason why I say that though is because if there was one particular like outlier reason as to why tier 1 teams are better than tier 2 teams, if there was one, then why have we seen at the majors that these tier 2 teams are able to upset these tier 1 teams if there was just one defining factor? And to me, because that's not the case where tier 2 teams do sometimes upset tier 1 teams, it just makes me think that it's just more so that the tier 1 teams are just overall better at everything, but the one thing that tier 2 teams often have over tier 1 teams is that they don't have pressure. And that pressure sometimes can be a huge difference, where if you're the tier 1 team where it's just like, dude, you got to you have to win this game to make the playoffs and, make your org happy, like that type of pressure, versus a tier 2 team where you're just like, dude, we made it this far. Dude, imagine if we beat this team too. That's completely different. And because of that, that difference in pressure can overcome like that 10 to 15% that the tier 1 team is, quote unquote better at. So that's my answer on that question. It's just simply, I think tier 1 teams are just a little bit better at all the aspects than tier 2, but that's why pressure will sometimes allow a tier 2 team to win.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, because they have like nothing to lose, and then like the tier 1 team is like, man, I'm gonna get clowned on Twitter. Like we can't lose this game, Like,
I mean, it's almost like a debuff. Like I'd say in those type of situations, it's almost like a debuff where it's like if you realize like the kind of position you're in and it's like it's a tough one, like it's that's where it comes to bite you. Like I remember there was a time when I was on NiP, the team we played against Furia and they had a coach. And let's just say anytime a team plays against another team that has a coach, there's always this like weird, we want to make sure you don't lose because you just look like a clown for losing to a team with a coach. But when it starts becoming reality, like that's when the pressure really hits, because you're just like, dude, how are we losing to a team that's playing with a coach? And that's when like it really, really builds. And I remember for us, like after that game, I just remember everybody was just so deflated, because it's just like, it's just inexcusable, It's just like, how does that happen? So yeah, that's why I'd say that, that's why these upsets can happen. That's why there's this like kind of, that's why to me, there's not just one clear answer as to why tier 1 is better than tier 2. It's just increments, and that those increments can be, they can be overcome by other factors.
That makes a lot of sense. I kind of like that like perspective too, because I like grinding shit. So like, just to know that like the tier 1 is just like, they're just better at everything. It's like, okay, just improve everything. Just start just keep working. It's not like some special, I don't know, like they got some superpower that is unachievable. It's just, they're just better at it. You can also
Yeah.
reach that too. You just got to improve at it too.
Hmm.
A little change of pace in the conversation. One of the things I wanted to ask you, because I saw that you did have a dedicated entry pathing playlist on your channel, and a lot of it was like specific maps and stuff.
Yeah.
Do you have a general like rule of thumb that can be applied to all types of entering? Because I all the time people comment and ask me like, yo, how do I help, like how do I entry and like how do I do this? And I had some answer I got from like one of my old coaches from forever ago. And I'm curious if you had an answer that like sums it all up pretty simply.
Answer that sums it up pretty simply. So entering, it's interesting that you talk about that first of all, because those are quite old videos that I've had. But I'm just gonna say, I think the main thing to me at least is just how close you are. Like, because whenever you entry, there's usually two walls. There's a close wall and there's a far wall. To me, you generally take the close wall when you want to be fast and when you want to surprise somebody. So let's just say, you're entering on B Inferno and you're trying to get to that guy's site. You're taking the close wall because you want to get to him like right away. This is typically when you have pistols or maybe you have like a Mac 10 or something like that. That's when you want to take the close wall. You want to surprise them. The far wall is more for getting like the best fight you can get, like because you're fairly close, you're fairly away from the wall. So like even if a guy with a pistol like peeks you up close, you still have pretty big advantage because you can literally see him peek out. So I'd almost just say like even as well when you're going on that far wall, you're more of like the cover. Like it's like if we talk about that example on B Inferno, you may have your entries come close to the wall to try to fight the site immediately, whereas you're on the far wall, you're just trying to cover them. You're just trying to cover them from people who are peeking like new box or like dark corner or spools or stuff like that. And also really strong against like on anti-ecos when you're clearing out a site. There's no reason for you to be fast. You just want to make sure you get the advantageous fights, and that's what going on the far wall does for you. Um, so to put it succinctly, those two walls are probably the most important in terms of like purpose. I think the other thing that's quite hard to nail down, and I'm very certain that like a lot of players don't really spend the time to do this, but it's essentially like knowing like the geometry of the map, like knowing what cover you have, knowing when you can crouch behind something, like what like all this stuff. For example, like B Mirage, when you go along the very right wall and you crouch down, right? The person on cat can see much less of yourself, if like might not even be able to see you. It's these kind of like details that you kind of want to be mindful of whenever you're entering into a site. So just like where are you exposed from, where can you be shot from, because that'll help essentially, that'll help like where to look, because if you know that you're covered from one side and you're exposed to another, you're going to make sure that you look at the exposed part as opposed to the spot that you're already covered. So I think that's the best way I can describe it.
Okay. Yeah, I've never heard of the what you're talking about, the walls. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I used to see in demos like the entry pathing where they like run up oranges like straight to new box.
Yeah.
And I would always see that and I'm like, dude, fuck doing that. That looks so scary, man. Like I just want to go to pool,
Yeah.
But I guess it makes sense with certain circumstances, like you're saying, like if you're on SMGs or something, like just get in their face, like you don't want to take that far fight.
Yeah.
The one thing I wanted to ask about that was I was taught this from Liger Rider. I don't know if he still plays or not. He coached us a while ago. He always told me that when it came to entry, you want like an entry duo. What is a duo necessary or no?
Nah, I mean, I think it depends a little bit on what level you play at. In my opinion, in tier 1, I think timing is more important than anything.
Okay.
Where if you can always get if you find an opening, if you find like some sort of like gap where you can catch somebody off guard, that's always going to be like more of the key than having somebody with you, because like as soon as that timing window is gone, even if you have that second player with you, they might have already gotten into like a better setup where they can handle you better now.
Oh
So
shit, yeah.
so to me, at least at the tier 1 level, I think timing is much more important. So if if it's the difference between, let's just say you're at the doorstep of B Inferno and you're like, you literally hear the guy first oranges and you're like right at the corner and your teammate's like far back like Broom and he's telling you to wait. I'd almost just say if you feel like there's that gap, it's more important to actually try to get that kill, knowing that like, maybe you just know that like he's shuffling nades, or like he's doing something that tells you that you know that he's not ready for it.
Yeah.
Um, but at a lower level, it's probably more safe to have a teammate with you, just because it's kind of like, I'd almost just say that your ability to read the game at a lower level, like if you're playing at that level, your ability to read the game at that level is probably not as refined as a tier 1 player. So going for those, you're probably going to be wrong more often than not. So I think that's how I stand on this position.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, he always said it was like two, and then they look at the same angle for like the trade potential, and then you have the third guy
Mm,
watching their back. So like, I guess the
mhm,
example like with Inferno would be like two run up oranges, and then the third guy goes to pool, or something along
mhm,
the lines of that.
yeah.
Also with your wall example, would you say like Anubis is similar to that? So like the padding on A site, like the far wall will be going up to
Yeah.
fountain, and then the close wall
Yes.
is like hugging to get
Exactly.
space. Okay, that
Exactly.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I pictured that in
Yeah.
my head when you were talking about that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Um,
exactly that.
would you say like another aspect of entering that like is really neglected is like when to stop, and like even as the entry, because that's something I noticed, like because I'd always just be like first in because I'm like, oh, I'm the shitty IGL, like let my teammates get the kills, you know, like I'd be like I'd be the first one in, and like I noticed that I would die a lot sometimes, and then they still wouldn't get the kills. I'm like, what the
Mhm.
fuck? And I
Yeah.
realized that like, oh wow, it's sometimes beneficial to like to stop uh
Mhm.
during entering. Did you find any ways that like to like rules of thumb of like when to stop, or also like how to help with people getting trades during executes or whenever?
Yeah. So this is a really, really tricky one. I'd almost just say like this is a really tricky one. I'd almost just say that the best example I can think of somebody who knows how to do this really well is Hampus. Like he's probably the only person I can think of, like, well, of course, because I've watched so much of him while being on the team. But if I were to kind of distill down like how he kind of does this kind of thing when he entries, it's essentially always prioritize making sure you get a good fight. And I would almost say that this is also a problem that some tier 1 IGLs have, where, you know, they're doing exactly what you described, where it's like they're trying to get all the space and all that stuff, but almost at the expense of them getting a good fight. So
Yeah.
I'd almost say that if you want to be better at it, you kind of have to think a little bit more selfishly, where it's like you don't need to go as fast as possible, but you want to go fast enough that you're taking space but not compromising a good fight. Like
Mm.
you don't want to get to a point where it's like you need to fight 3 angles at once. Maybe just 2, maybe 2 is okay and you can manage that, but it's like if you're going in there to just be the sacrificial lamb type of thing and you're just like hoping that you get a headshot somewhere, that's probably not the way to go. So, yeah, I'd say I'm just trying to think of like who are some really good examples, because the thing is it's also really hard. Like what I said sounds simple, but like it's
Yeah.
also very hard because you also have to deal with like a bunch of utility coming at you, and you just may not have like a good spot. But maybe just that slight mindset shift in at least that's why I saw with Hampus whenever he would like take these type of fights where, you know, he's rushing in with the team. It always felt like he prioritized having a good fight more than actually taking the space.
Mm.
Like taking the space is secondary to having a good fight. But
Yeah.
it is a very fine balance because you don't want to not take space. Like you don't want to get to the point where it's like you're just holding the angle waiting for the guy to peek, but he's not going to peek. But just being able to recognize like those small openings and like the small like windows of timing that you have. And another thing that can kind of help with this is just, you know, like when your teammates throw flashes and stuff like that, like how soon are you going off the pop? Are you going before the pop? Are you going as it pops, or are you going after it pops? Like these are all considerations you'd have to have like whenever you're doing anything like this, because those extra seconds could mean the difference between you jumping out of the window on B Mirage or still at the top apartments part. So that's what I'd say.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like that, yeah, like you're saying, it's really hard. That's probably like just like mastery of entering. Cause I feel like, you know, like level one is just like you fucking run to Tetris on A-Site Mirage, and you sit there and you wait for the default guy to peek you. You know, everyone goes and does that. Like level 2 is like, all right, I'm not gonna be a bitch no more. Like I'm gonna make some space for my teammates, and you're like sacrificial lamb. Like okay, I end up dying, but at least I make space. Like that's definitely better than going Tetris and bullshitting over there. And then level 3 is like knowing when to stop, like and like actually take good fights. Because I feel like there's still probably some circumstances where like the best play is not to get a good fight. It's actually just to make space, and you know you probably end up dying. Like, but you end up winning the game. Would you say like as you're talking about that, I was picturing like I guess like in terms of like protocols for a team, how to like master entering. Like the first guy going in probably will like end up just totally dictating the space, and then the second guy just completely plays off of him, so he can dictate of like when he's going in fully or like when he's taking the fight. Like, would you say that's like a good like? I guess you say like protocol for like how entering should work is like the first guy dictates the space, or maybe like the space is already or the pacing is already dictated like with a certain execute in mind, like, or maybe it's like both. I don't know. I'm kind of like just thinking out loud like now. Yeah.
Honestly, I'm gonna say I think it's a combination of all of those.
Okay.
But the most important one is just that it's communicated. So I'm assuming that if you're on a team, it's something that you guys talk about beforehand. Like if you're entering out on a Mirage, like maybe it's like you guys talk about, do you guys go sandwich first or do you clear under balcony? Like that's a conversation. It may be obvious to some people, may not be to others. And as well, maybe there's some situations where it's as simple as, hey, you just follow the first guy, look at what he's covering, you just cover the opposite. And other ones might just be like, you know, you kind of talk about like what is going to like how far you're going, because you know there is some I guess there's like a prodding that also happens too, like when we talk about entering, where it's just like you're not like fully committed but you're like trying to get as deep as you can. There's also that type where it's like in that kind of situation, you as a second player you may not want to like hug the first guy, you may just want to like cover him so that he can get away. Like the best example I can think of this is like Inferno B. Say you have your entry who's like creeping up towards the entrance of the site. He's like trying to find that guy first oranges, and then the second guy he's like a little bit further back where he's spotting the CT peak. Like that's an example of like you're entering, but it's more of a prod, and it's not the same entering as like you're doing a site take where then both people would actually like follow up behind each other. So I'd almost just say the clear and concise answer is it should always be communicated, whether that's before the match, like in practice, or before it happens, and maybe even like during freeze time, where it's just like, you know, where you can kind of picture like what's about to happen, but it's not like so planned out where it's like you talked about during practice. It's more of like a read that you have.
Okay.
So I think that's probably the best answer I can give you. It's not like a clear one, but it's more so just make sure you communicate and that it's clear like what both players should be doing and like what kind of goal they're trying to achieve.
Yeah. I guess CS is just that like dynamic when it comes to like entry on some sites where you can't just apply one rule to all. So like the only rule you can apply is just make sure everyone's on the same page. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Do you have any time constraints?
No, I'm good.
No? Okay. Because I have a lot of here. I gotta see which ones I've missed so far. I have a lot of questions, and I don't want to miss out on viewer questions. Also, I don't want to like burden you either, because I feel like after the 90-minute mark, I know for me personally, like I start getting like brain fog. So let me see what we can do here, and maybe we could possibly say this for like another interview if you're possibly down or
sure,
or not.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got the entry pathing. Okay, this question I want to ask you, but I feel like this is gonna be like this can go for a while. Okay. I think we can get through all these. Okay, so the next question I want to ask you, I've asked this both to Wraith and MDS about like styles of maps. Do you have a category for each like type of map, and like you approach different types of maps differently? Because I remember listening to I think it was like a Thorn Strat book podcast like forever ago, and I think it was Tabson, and he was like, yeah, well, like when this map came out, we just applied the philosophy from yada yada yada, and it just worked instantly. And I was like, oh shit, people like approach maps differently. Like I've been playing a lot of these maps like the same philosophy, so I started like thinking of how to play maps differently. Like what are the advantages and disadvantages of certain maps? So like for me personally, I looked at it from just a CT side perspective, and like CT side, I was thinking there's take and hold maps, which is like banana on Inferno, ramp on Vertigo, and like Ivy and mid on Ancient, where it's like you have an advantage from taking this map control. And then there's like maps on CT side that are like all about re-aggression. So like Overpass and Anubis, like clear advantages in re-aggression because of how big the map is. Like there's 4 lanes. T's can't hold everything. And then the other one was like reactivity. So like fast rotate. So like the map is more about not just like taking something and getting advantage from taking something, but about how well you can react off the information. So like Overpass, you're at B site from A in like literally like 3 seconds. Like from you can see from heaven. And then Nuke is like you got some pretty fast rotates too, like the heaven guy to ramp. You know, if the ramp guy's already J, you can go straight to heaven. Like you can drop vent, shit like that. And then Wraith put me on to the idea of like dual heavy maps, but that's kind of like T-sided, I guess, where like you're looking for dual. Oh, maybe that applies CT side too. I don't know. I permanently had Mirage banned, so that's probably like why I never thought about these types of maps. But those are like the categories I could think of, and like I would kind of just like not necessarily play strictly to those strengths, but I would be aware of them and play like just I would lean more towards playing towards those strengths on certain maps because of like how the map is designed. Do you approach maps with the same type of like philosophy in terms of like how you play maps differently, or is it like some other completely thing that I'm just like completely off on?
I'd say that probably not like the entire map. I think what's much more common is like portions of the map. So
Okay.
for example, you know, like what Tabson was saying, it's like, oh, we applied this philosophy. It's like I definitely see that in like, you know, Banana on Inferno, Vertigo, a ramp, you know, same type of idea where it's like you take this area of the map and it's like the most contested part. You know, there's maybe even some argument that Dust Too Long A could be like that too, if the spawns change a little bit. But I'd say it's much more like how I see it at least is more so like sections of the map, like how are they similar, how are they different? So to me it's kind of like what's a good example? It's kind of like I'll just say a little bit off the top of my head. So like Overpass, I feel like it's much more of like a map control type of map, right? Like on T side at least, where it's like, you know, you kind of want water, you kind of want connector, and you kind of want like the bathrooms long area before you like decide on something, right? Whereas a map like Nuke, you don't necessarily need all of those. Like you don't need to have secret and ramp for you to like do a bomb site hit, right?
Yeah,
Like you
yeah.
just do it off an exec. Um, that being said, like there's certain areas that kind of open up the same types of opportunities. Like in the same way that Ancient and Anubis, like Ancient does that cave area, right? Just taking that first room, I think it's called Cheetah in North
Yeah.
America.
Yeah.
Cheetah in North America. Like just taking that first room is similar to taking E-Box and Anubis, right? Same kind of philosophy, because as soon as you take that, then you kind of have this like pinching effect on the B site. That's one way to kind of think of it. And that's why on Ancient, like sometimes you see that teams, when that happens, they end up aggressing B ramp. Where at the same time on Anubis, when teams take both sides, sometimes you see the CTs, they aggress B main. It's the same kind of idea. Um, I'd say that I kind of think of it from that lens. I tend not to like the most macro I'll do is just what I just described earlier, where it's like, is it more of a map control map, or like can I exec on this map without taking a lot, or is it like you know, piece by piece, like how do they function as a whole? Like, you know, Mirage mid, there's an argument that Mirage mid and Ancient mid is kind of similar. Um, so that's kind of how I think of things. I think of
Okay.
them in like puzzle pieces as opposed to just like this is how one thing works, because I just think as well that there's a lot of like micro detail in terms of like how you take that area of the map, and like how you know, whether you use utility to take it and whether there's like a timer on how long CTs can kind of hang around there for. I think it makes a big difference. Like for example, I'll say that Nuke outside on Nuke is slightly different compared to Dust Too Long, just because it's like Dust Too Long, like as soon as you get a guy towards Pit, he just locks down that whole area for the most part. On Nuke, even though it's like a wide open area, it's it's harder for a CT to just like push all the way up to the point where like they're behind that box and
Yeah.
like they have it all locked down, right? So I think that's where like the differences kind of come into play.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense at like looking at like just the specifics differently, like
Yeah.
in terms of the map control. I think the reason I did that was because for like calling purposes. So like I would just totally center my calls like on Inferno and Vertigo, mainly those two. Sometimes Ancient, just like how the main map control is being contested. So like Inferno, like all I do was just call around Banana. Like it's always calling around Banana. Vertigo, I always call around Ramp. And then I was finding out like on these other maps, it's like, oh shit, I don't have anything to call around. Like like we kind of had to win this game in the mid round, type of stuff. Like I found out Overpass is like a lot about just like finding that re-aggro and communicating that like mid game versus like how are we approaching water control as a CT. Like I just noticed that like from like an IGL perspective, like that's why I like kind of like classify these maps to kind of like dictate my calls. Like you said with Nuke too, like you don't need like all this map control. Like you could just hit A like just to hit A sometimes. And like I mean outside I guess you're trying to take it as like a T, but the one thing I was just thinking about as you're talking is that like maybe I was kind of like forced to do this type of like calling because of the lack of anti-stratting and reads, because I'd have to get these, because I'm like looking for ways to win around, and so the most obvious way to find reads is like with like the most obvious part of the, like the most desired part of the map, but like at the higher level I guess you're just winning rounds based off like even more minute things that you can find out that have nothing to do with like map control, and maybe it's just like, and that's why you stress more like individual puzzle piece type of stuff, because you can win the game through that, not just by winning. I'm getting lost. Do you see what I'm saying? Like
I see what you're saying.
yeah,
I think it's just more so that I think it's more so just that at the lower levels it is much more about kind of the macro of things, because the playbook isn't that developed at those levels. Whereas
yeah,
it's like at tier 1, or I'll just even say tier 2 as well, at the higher levels, it's like people have a lot of plays for stuff. So it's like if you're even weak on like one of those areas, like they're going to exploit you to the point where until you figure out how to stop it, like they're just going to kind of keep doing it
yeah.
until you. So yeah, I think one thing that you said, oh, I'm sorry, I'm losing track as well.
Take your
But there's
time. Take your
something that you
time.
said yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, you can move on. If it comes back to me,
You sure?
I'll bring it up again. Yeah.
What was it? What was I talking about? Just like the map control stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Chain. I approached
It
it
was something
differently
to
at a
do with
lower
nuke.
level.
Yeah,
Nuke. Oh, outside on Nuke, how
yeah.
it's like you don't need outside to hit A, or was
Mhm.
it had to do with that, or I'm trying to jog your memory.
I think it was something along those lines, or I thought about something, but then it's not like directly related to what you said. It
Uh,
was something that just made me think of something else. So, no, it's
okay.
okay. You can move on.
If it comes back, interrupt me. All right.
Yeah.
Uh, let me see. Let me see. What I had some. Okay, anti-stratting. I'm so lost right now in these questions. All right. Oh. All right. Difference in maps. We already asked that. This is another question I had. I remember Infohip, I my old
Yeah.
teammate. He told, because he was working with was he working? He was working with the female. I think like Goose Breeders team, some female team, and he was like coaching them. So he had like
Mm,
contact with like Elige, and he was
mm,
like asking Elige like a bunch of stuff, and getting like information from Elige himself. I'm like, that's crazy. And one thing I wanted him to ask was like, how many of like the IGL's calls, like I think it was Nitro at the time, like how many of the calls are just like, dude, fuck it, rush B, like just like some random shit. There's like, I don't know, like throw something at the wall.
yeah.
So with your time in like NIP, was that common, or was there like always reason, like rhyme, like a reason behind like the rhymes, and like they always had a why for why they're doing something?
Well, okay. So the why, I'd say that yes, there's a percentage of plays that are just called where it's just like, yeah, let's just do it.
Yeah.
But it's much more than just like because I'm out of ideas, or I'd say it was more like there was some sort of read, but wasn't like a read that could be described in words. It was more
Mm.
of like a, okay, I feel like this guy's kind of weak, or like I feel like, um, or it could even be like, oh, we run this strat before in practice, like this is our best chance of like getting it through. and keep in mind as well, I'd say that like these kind of calls happen more so like when you're stuck, like when when it's like the game has kind of gone away from you and you're just like, we just need something that's just going to work. So I'd say that yeah, like I'd say there's a decent portion, especially when a team is losing, where you're gonna see like these kind of calls, and it's not so much like not everything has a read because even for IGLs, like even though they're like in control of the game, they still don't like they don't have the perspective of every single player. They don't know exactly how everything is going down. They only have how they feel the game is going. So I'd say that yeah, there's definitely those kind of calls, and it's not nearly as measured as one might think.
Okay, that's that's relieving. Um, the I think that covers most of the stuff. Yeah, I think that covers all the questions. One thing I was just thinking about as you were talking though, about like how like the IGL doesn't have like all like the information. How do you have any experience with like setting up like team systems that incorporate all the players in order to like dictate calls? So like something I tried for a little bit was like I try to have like a primary goal of of the rounds and then like a secondary goal. And like there would be conditioning and cashing out based off that. So like I would be focused on like the primary conditioning, which would be like usually like the main map control. So let's say like T side on an overpass, we're like going towards Bath, and I'm responsible for like what we're throwing there and how we're conditioning and how we're cashing out there. And then my B lurk guy, he's responsible for conditioning things as well to cash out eventually. So like he could be conditioning a monster lurk smoke, and he could do that regardless of whatever take we're doing towards A. And then like one of these rounds he's got to read like, yo, fuck it, let's actually use this monster lurk smoke. We'll creep up and pop through it. Another example is like Inferno T side. Like I would be well, this map was different because I wasn't responsible for banana, but it would be based off banana control. And then like the secondary goal would be like apps. Like what is my teammate conditioning apps? Like has he been throwing the apps lurk smoke or towards brackets? Like how can we abuse like conditioning and cashing out that's been over there? Are there like I don't know, is that like seem reasonable? Like or have you experienced like other types of systems that incorporate everyone into the call, not just the IGL and like being a dictator type stuff. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah, yeah. So the system that you said is very common
oh
among
really?
most teams. Yeah,
Oh
I'd say,
shit, yo, I came up with
and
yeah.
I'd say it's pretty common. Um, and as well, you'll also notice that a lot of IGLs put themselves in the same areas of the map on T side because it's just like it's kind of just like it's the best place to be in. Like you'll notice like on Inferno T side, for example, a lot of IGLs are typically towards like B slash banana or B slash mid. Like they're not the primary banana guy, but they're the guy that's assisting the
That
banana
yeah, that was
guy.
me. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And like on Mirage, a lot of IGLs are usually like that mid guy who kind of floats around. And I almost want to say that a lot of teams um like it may not be as clear cut. Like I can't say I have like a direct experience where it's like it's this clear cut, but it's more on like how good the lurkers are. Like the people who are on the extremities of the map of like in terms of how well have they been conditioning themselves on their own. Sometimes they don't actually like put these into words where it's just like what they're actually doing, but they are the type of people that you're describing where it's just like, maybe they've kind of funneled the opponent to a place where it's just like, yo, if we just run this thing, it's going to work. So I'd say to facilitate that the best, you kind of want to have these players in spots where it makes sense for them to do that. So, for example, like if you're the IGL and you're like playing more of a lurky extremity type of position, you're probably not going to get the best like read of the game just because you only have one area of the map, right? Like there's only so much you can do and see from one side of the map. That's why you see IGLs in the middle of the spot. Whereas, these like more secondary callers they're usually either on the other side of the map or they're on some sort of extremity where they can act as like um, a swing point where it's kind of like, hey, if something goes wrong on this side of the map, like, you know, this is like the call to bring like the main group over. Um, So I'd say that's probably the best way to describe it, and like what a lot of teams kind of do. And the spots where this is most common, I'd say, is like Vertigo is so common for there to be a main pack that either takes B or A, and then the other guy is like on the other side where, essentially if things go wrong, they all swing back, or like if he's conditioned them to a point where it's just like, hey, I think we can just pop on this guy, that's where it comes into play. Used to be a big thing on Overpass, pretty big thing on Ancient, I'd say. Like, the person who typically likes to go red room after you take mid, and then the rest of the
Yeah.
group either go towards B or maybe they go towards A. Like that guy, whoever that guy is, should be, your secondary voice, because you want to put him in those kind of positions. Shouldn't be the IGL, because he needs to control like where the group goes, but this secondary person needs to be in one of these like extremity impact positions. So I'd
Okay.
say most teams kind of do what you're describing.
Okay, that's cool. Cause I've never played under an IGL before. So like a lot of this stuff is like I'm learning from like my teammates because they played under IGL, or like I'm like trying to come up with a way to structure
Mhm.
shit, and that's pretty relieving hearing that like that's a pretty common way to play with like
Yeah.
different goals across the map. All
Mhm.
right, we can go to some of these viewer questions and we'll end up wrapping it up. Also, I forgot to say this earlier. Wraith was in the chat. He said, "Hi, Sam and Mahone. Good to catch us live." He's in the chat here.
Yeah,
Someone else
what's
called you
up?
the GOAT too, Zilly2K. All right. So the first question was from Laz TV on Twitter. Who is your favorite caster, and does the Godacon Inferno game give him nightmare? He'll know.
So favorite caster, I think I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't say it was Laz. Me and Laz actually casted together like years and years ago
Oh
before.
shit.
Yeah, we did. We did. We actually went to a couple of lands together to cast. So, maybe one day we'll cast again
Hey.
together. But his second question of the Godicon thing. So this was a LAN in 2015 where essentially me and Laz, like we lived in like the same area. We always went to all these LANs and we always played against each other for the most part. We're really close. And it was just that at this particular LAN, he came back like 14-9 against me or something like that. And he felt like it was a pretty unbelievable match just because he felt like he was just going to lose entirely, but he did it. But regardless, I still won the LAN, so
Oh
it doesn't
hey.
bother me that
No nightmares. No
much.
nightmares.
Yeah, yeah.
The next question. There was one in chat earlier. Let me see. Let me see. Oh, Garrett said, "Woohoo! Wow, Mahone, OG man, watched his vids years ago." Uh, oh, he was asking about the timings on entering. When you're asking about how the timings are more important, he said, "How do you find those timings?"
How do you find those timings?
Yeah,
I mean, the the fun way is to just play and just figure it out and just get it feel for it intuitively. But the actual way and the really hard way that nobody wants to do is to actually test it in a server. Um, I don't know how far CS2 plugins have gotten nowadays, but I know in CS:GO, like you could, especially with Refrag. I know Refrag had this for sure. Practice mode had this for sure. It's like literally test out like, you know, create the actual bot scenarios where like you're the guy who's holding B, and then have the other bot like do a simulation of him running in, and like that's how you'd find the timing. That's how you'd figure it out. And just from doing that, you'll be able to kind of see like exactly what it should be.
mm,
That being said, like it's a pretty boring way to do it. It's
not
pretty
fun.
tough.
Yeah,
It's not fun at all. So I guarantee very few people actually do that kind of stuff. But yeah, the fun way would just be to just keep trying it when you're in your games, and eventually you'll get a feel for it. But
good
on
answer.
like a more logical way, it's just like like I said before, in terms of like distances and stuff like that, like how close you are or how far you are from the corners, like that's going to dictate like how much space you really end up getting off of flash or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. I think Refrag had that like replay thing.
Yeah, I think it's
I
called Restrat or something like that, or
yeah,
I might be wrong.
yeah. It was
Yeah.
restrat. I didn't know how the fuck to use that shit, man. That was too complicated for me. The Wraith. So Wraith was he actually had, bro, he sent me a paragraph when he found out I was interviewing you. So the first one was He said, I remember seeing Mahone with NiP team in Stockholm Major rubbing devices' shoulders between maps. LOL. I'm curious how much the personal aspects of a team impact performance. Do teammates need to be friends? How do you maintain morale? How much do players and the coach need to be on the same page to play a system? It would be interesting to hear the answer since I see you as a very methodical person interested in a systematic play. Were you surprised?
Okay, so first question: Do teammates need to be friends? My opinion is no, they don't need to be, but they need to actually get along at least. Like they have to actually get along. In my experience at NiP, I think it was pretty fortunate when it came to this, where a lot of the past players, like because the Swedish scene was so small, um, a lot of these people actually already played with each other at some point, like in the past, and it just so happens that it's just like this is the culmination of where their careers have landed them. Um, so I'd say that's it's not a requirement, but it definitely helps. What was the second question? Hold on, let me.
Yeah, you can pull it up. It was how do you maintain morale?
How do you maintain morale? So this is a really tough one, and I think that if there was any team that cracked it, um, I should say, I don't think there's really any team that's really cracked this one because I think at this level, like losing always sucks, and I think every team loses at some point. Like there's no team that's just so undefeated. So um, maintaining morale, I feel like a common tactic I hear a lot is essentially to just be open and have those sessions after practice games or whatever where you empty the backpack, so it's called. I think that's probably the easiest way because it gets people to kind of talk about their feelings and like talk about what's been going wrong in a way that doesn't feel as confrontational because it's like the space is carved out just for that. And
Yeah.
that sets up a very different environment. So I think that's probably the most that you can do from the outside. As like a player on the inside, I feel like to do that, you got to be somebody who's basically like untiltable. I think that's probably the if you have a leader who's untiltable, you'll probably have a pretty good morale for the rest of the team. Because, I mean, I think a big thing for teams is just like how you kind of act definitely spreads across to the rest of the team. And I experienced this as well in the sense that like during that COVID time when I was in the Stockholm office, like even little things like, giving a pat on the shoulder or giving fist bumps and stuff like that, it goes a long way because it kind of lets the players know that, they're not in this kind of thing alone and they're not, they don't have to feel as trapped when things are going poorly.
The other question was how much do the players and coach need to be on the same page to play a system?
Okay, so I think they definitely do need to be on the same page. Whether they actually agree with the system, I think that's up for debate. Like maybe the IGL has a system that the coach doesn't really agree with, but the coach goes along with it anyways, and they're on the same page about it. I think that's the most important part. Would it be the best if both the IGL and the coach were like saw the game the exact same way? I feel yes and no because if they see the game the exact same way, there's going to be gaps that they're not seeing.
Mm.
Whereas if you have a coach and an IGL who they have like the same kind of like vision, but like the specifics are a little bit different, I think that's where the ideal spot is because you want to be able to kind of see the gaps that the other person isn't seeing. And for me, that was kind of like the relationship that I had with, I guess, um, with Threat and Hampus at the time, which was just like another third perspective of because I felt that I viewed the game slightly different than Hampus did and then Threat did. Although we had like the same like type of vision, the specifics were like a little bit different, and I think those specifics are what's important.
Yeah, I noticed that the same thing too is I used to my teammate Josh, always lucky, me and him would always be having disagreements like after games because we just saw it differently. I was always so methodical, like I want structure, and he was just like, bro, let me just go take a duel, like let me go kill someone, and he was all about that. And I always thought that was like the best thing for us because like combining the two like gives you something, it makes it way more dynamic, like you said, you're seeing another perspective that is normally like neglected if it's just everyone on the same page.
Hmm.
Um, the next question that Wraith had was how much input do pro players provide in building a system? Do you do most of the theory work and then have them give feedback, or are they present from the very start?
I think in general they're present from the very start because at the end of the day, they're the ones that actually have to do it. But at the same time, for us as support staff, coaches, or whatever you want to call us, it's important that we facilitate this discussion of like the philosophy of how we want to play these maps. Because as long as we kind of have like philosophy that the players agree with and can execute, that's the most important thing. Because the worst thing that you can do is essentially, you know, spend all this time developing a system that your players just don't even buy into, and even if they try to follow it, like they're not giving it their all. Like they're not completely convinced like this is the best way to play. So in my mind, it's always best to kind of have the players in from the start. And the job of the support staff is essentially to facilitate what this is going to look like and try to shape it the best way possible so that um, you're getting the best of both worlds where coaches tend to be a bit more analytical and players definitely tend to be a bit more feeling based and stuff like that because they're the ones in the actual server. Being able to kind of mold these two together into one particular style philosophy per map per side per whatever, I think that's generally the way to go.
That it's kind of like on a similar topic. That reminds me of something I heard Kerrigan say. How he always throws out his old strat book whenever he joins a new team, and it's probably like to get the buy-in from all the players. Like you can't play the same
Mm,
way with everyone, and people I feel like they're being heard, and like how they want to play is being established into like the philosophies. That's probably extremely helpful, like with morale and like just how well they're gonna try
yeah,
with whatever system you want. Um,
yeah.
so there's actually,
Just one more
oh
thing.
yeah, yeah,
I just wanted to add one more thing. I think as well, like when you have this philosophy or whatever, right? It's always a thing that develops over time because you are eventually going to get those practice games where it's going to make you reevaluate like, is this even the right way to play? Like you're going to get those games, and how you deal with those is also just as key. And it's in those moments where it can be beneficial to actually have people who played on different teams where they have like a certain way of doing things. I think that's really important because I remember back on NIP there was a time we were playing on train, like we did like a scrim, and we just kept losing B, and we just didn't have a good way of retaking it. But then, after like a few games, Device was just like, "Hey, like on the straws, we used to like do this retake setup. Like we used to set it up in this way." And afterwards, after we implemented it, it started working. So I'd almost just say that like, even though even though you may just throw out the initial strat book that you had from other teams, don't be afraid to pull it out when the time calls for it when you start to struggle because it's like if it because you're going to get to those situations where you don't have the answers from your current like set of from your current team, so you're going to have to pull it from somewhere, and often it's from past teams or maybe even from a demo or whatever because this thing's always evolving. It's never going to always be like a set thing.
yeah. That I'm glad you commented on that. Like where you question like your philosophies, because I thought I was like the only one that had like that existential dread after like a game or something. Where it's like, dude, I spent all this time like thinking this is the right way to play, and then
Yeah.
like it just like the past week it's just like it's not working, and then you got to like change something up. So that's actually pretty. It's pretty cool to hear that pro players also deal with the same thing. They're like kind of like the big thing I always want to ask is like about the infallibility, and it kind of shows that they're not infallible. They're also human who
Hmm.
have like their own weaknesses and stuff in their game. Um,
Yeah.
there's a viewer question that just came in, but I'm gonna get through Wraith's first, and we'll hit the viewer one, and then we'll call it there. Um, Wraith also asked. He said, in a similar vein, I remember NIP being a team that had very solid defaults, good conditioning and masking, set protocols for map control. What did practice look like to achieve it?
What did practice look like to achieve it? Okay, so essentially a lot of theory. I think for the most part, for most full time teams, it's always going to be like a theory session and then, scrims. But I think what we did a little bit differently back then, and, I don't think I'm giving away anything at this point just because I feel like a lot of teams have kind of, they've adopted this system or they have something a bit more complicated. But essentially, like, I think the big thing for us was, first of all, having a philosophy on like how we play. Like even though it changed over time, and even though it might have gotten simpler over time, just the fact that we talked about it in the first place kind of put us on the same page of like what kind of team we kind of want to be. Second thing is that when we scrimmed, we had two types of scrims. The first one was essentially for practicing very specific things, and for these, like we didn't care whether or not we won or lost them. What we're trying to do is essentially just figure out like does this thing that we're doing, does it work or does it not. And the second type of scrim that we would play is the one to win. And I think a lot of teams do this now, where you're putting you're putting your theory to actual practice to see like does it work when there's like quote unquote more pressure on the line. um this is kind of what we did. And to be honest, like when I look back, it's like it's weird because I feel that how we looked in practice in general definitely looked better than officials, because I think in officials it's like it's hard to actually translate the way that you play in practice to officials, because sometimes it's just things that come up that you don't expect, and sometimes people just play differently for whatever reason. um so that said, it's like even though we practice in that way, it's like we put a lot of thought into it, but sometimes it just wouldn't pan out in the way that we wanted to. And that's kind of like the toughest part I think about having a team, is being able to kind of close that gap between practice and actual officials. And that's, one where, especially for NIP at the time, we had loads of player changes throughout like the whole year that I was there. So it was almost just like it was almost just like resetting each time. And even though we would take parts of the old strat book, we'd still be adding in new stuff and essentially, you know, making sure that we never get stale. So I'd say it's almost a combination of all those things, and it's hard to kind of pinpoint like one specific reason. So I've kind of shared just the overall process of what it looked like.
That just made me think of something. That's kind of off topic real quick. I just want to comment on that. How you're switching players. Do you think that also helps with just like counter anti-stratting? Is that's why like the top level like the people swap so much like to keep things fresh, because it's not really about like I don't know. Do you think that plays into it? Like
It definitely plays into it a little bit, but probably not enough to be like, "Yo, we should keep switching just so that we don't get
yeah.
anti-strat." Probably not to that
Okay.
level.
Okay. I was just thinking
But
about that.
but that is a small detail though. Like anyone who's been an analyst for a top team will know that whenever a team swaps a player or two players, it's almost like you're almost starting from zero again, where you're
Yeah.
just like, how is this team going to play? Because it's going to be different, and depending on the player, maybe it's an anchor player. If it's an anchor player, it's probably not going to be too different. You just need to see like where the differences are, just based on the areas that they play. But if you have like a different offer, or you have a different IGL, or any of these kind of
Oh
things, it's
yeah.
like it's almost just like anything that you thought, or you kind of, yeah, any preconceived notion you had about the team before those changes, like, they're just out the window. You basically just start from scratch again. You treat them more or less like a new team.
Yeah. Okay. The last question from Wraith was, would love to learn how you recorded your earlier analyst videos in terms of editing in particular, since I feel that style is still present in your desk analyst segments.
So my old videos, when he says this, I'm assuming he's referring to the ones where I used to draw on the screen and stuff like that. Um, so where do I even start with this? So the reason why I did that, so how I edited those in the first place was essentially I just recorded the footage, I edited it, and then I would play it in VLC, and then I'd draw over it with Epic Pen or whatever. That's how I technically did it. Now the reason why I did it that way is because I kind of felt that at the time, whenever I looked at CS analysis content, I was just kind of like it was hard to digest without somebody pointing out exactly what I'm supposed to look at.
Mm.
So that's the whole reason why I did it that way. And as far as me doing that on broadcasts, um, I can't necessarily say it was inspired just from the way that just because I did that, but it was more so because Blast, they had this idea of having a telestrator segment for a long time. Like they wanted somebody to do this, somebody who has the ability to do this. and they saw my old videos, or they saw my videos at the time. They're just like, "Yo, we see that you're no longer with NiP, or you left. Yo, would you be down to do this? Because we think that you'd be perfect for it." In the same way that these telestrated segments are kind of like what you see on sports broadcasts, like football or hockey or
Mm.
whatever. That was the idea behind it. So, um, main difference is on broadcast, I edit the video incredibly quickly, and when I do all the drawing, it's basically on like an entirely separate program. It's called Fingerworks. If anybody's interested, a license is like a bunch of money. You
Oh
probably can't
shit.
buy it, but it was on a separate software, and that's kind of how I did it. And everything that I did from those segments definitely drew on like some sort of aspect that I did on YouTube. I always kind of used my YouTube as a way to, first of all, create the content that I wish I had or that I want to see, and as well, as a way to practice as well. Because one of the best ways to get better at anything is to practice, and that's what I use my YouTube channel for as well.
100%. Yeah, that's crazy that the content actually got you the analyst job and then also the broadcasting job.
Yeah,
How
yeah,
far that got you with just making videos alone. So like yeah, I always thought that was like a really big thing was just making video. Even if you're trying to go pro, just make videos because it helps in like every aspect. People just know of you more. Like I've gotten
mhm.
like tryouts for teams that like I remember I never played main before and I was like making videos and I remember I was getting main offers. I was like, holy shit, like I'm up there, like.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
I'll like I don't know. It helps so much to just like getting your name out there, like recognition, and I don't know. You can find yourself with job opportunities, like what happened with you.
Yeah.
Um,
And one more thing to add
yeah.
on that. I think the best thing about it, you probably feel this too, but whenever you make videos, I feel like you just gain a better understanding of what it is you're trying to talk about,
Oh yeah.
because you're trying to make it clear to your audience, right? So I'll say, like, over time when I made these videos, it wasn't like I had all this knowledge or the ability to break things down, from the start. It's like it's something that was it was a skill that was developed over time. And like the more I made videos, the more that I even continued to understand the game and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So
Yeah.
it's a big thing.
Yeah. I used to remember like thinking that like to justify like not practicing. I'm like, because like I would make a video, so I'd talk about a topic, and just talking about something makes you understand it more.
Yeah.
And then like I would go and edit the video and I'm fucking, replaying this one section like 18 times. And it's like, never do this one, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, I get it now. It's like it's stuck in my brain. Like it helped me
Yeah.
learn shit that I'm like trying to communicate like really
Yeah.
well. So that's like another huge benefit. And another thing I was thinking about too was just even like putting ideas out there and like having a stance on like how to play the game. Even if it is wrong and it might suck to get corrected in the comments, like you're learning from that. Like I've made videos sometimes where like I put it out there and then people are like, no, this is actually wrong because of blank blank blank. I'm like, oh shit, I just learned something. Even though like you gotta like put your ego aside and like be like, you could be wrong when making a video, but that could be
Yeah.
beneficial though because you're learning from that. Even just like being wrong, it like it
Yeah.
literally helps on every aspect. Like also it feels cool when you're in game and someone's like, yo, I watch your videos. Like
Yeah.
that's so cool. Like that's low-key the best part. Fuck everything else. But all right, so this is the last question. We'll wrap it up here. So Garrett just asked, not sure if viewer questions are done. This might be dumb, but what is a system? How does every team have a different system? Aren't there only so many things you can do?
Hmm. A system. So this is a complicated question, because a system can literally refer to the way a team practices. It could refer to the way a team kind of functions, like both in and out of the server. And I think what this question is referring to, though, is the system within a game, like the technical aspects, like as in, if there's a meta, how come everybody doesn't just literally follow the meta and there's no new innovation or development, or how come everybody doesn't just play the same way? I think the reason for this is because there's conflicting ideas behind um you know what uh what's considered optimal and what's not. So the best example for this is possibly back in CS:GO, where saving was such a big deal, especially on maps like Inferno. And the team that was most famous for it was Virtus Pro, and this is something that even our team began to adopt because we kept losing to these guys. We kept losing to these guys, so we were like, yeah, we need to steal something from them. And the biggest thing that we got from them was essentially that like saving is, it's like it feels lame to do, but the reason why it was so effective during that time was because you essentially give yourself more chances at gun rounds. So it's kind of like a no-brainer where it's like if you're in a, let's say, a 3-on-4 and retaking the B site on Inferno, chances seem low. Hey, let's just save the weapons and we'll do something really good next round too because we have the weapons. The thing is that everybody's threshold for what that point is of when they would save is different. And that is the reason why there's different systems, because everybody thinks of certain situations differently. There's different thresholds. I know for us, when we were first trying to implement this, hey, let's save like Virtus Pro, it was hard for the players to get used to it because, they're used to going for like those 3v4 retakes or like the 2v3s. And, we had to get really clear on the fact that like, hey, if we're in any sort of disadvantage coming into the retake, that's when we just save. And that was weird for the team to actually do. Over time, we got a lot better at it because, we defined it a lot more, or we ended up defining it on all the maps, like what that like breaking point is. But that's really the reason why, like, there's different systems, is because everybody has like a different threshold for that exact situation I just described. And it applies to all aspects of the game. Some teams think that like, it's way too slow to be executing at 15 seconds left on the clock. And then some teams think that, it's way too fast to be hitting a bomb site at minute 30, So it's because of this like differing perspective. That's why we get different systems within all these teams.
Yeah, I guess like a system, it would just be like just combining everything, like philosophy, like how people want to play individually, and then like rules and protocols all into like one big thing. And that's like what the system is. It's just a combination of everything and how a team plays a certain map. That was the last question. This actually went a lot longer than I expected, but I'm glad it did. I actually learned so much from this. Like I'm gonna like low key rewatch this. Like when I'm editing it back and like get the timestamp, I'm gonna be taking notes. But I appreciate you coming on, Mahone. Is there anything that we can expect from you soon with content or casting or maybe another analyst job, or what's new for you? What's new for you? Anything coming up?
What's new for me right now? So, as some people might know, I've started working at Leadify. It's a big kind of like stats website. And, my goal with that is essentially to kind of do cool things with data. And, it's taking a little bit of time, but, hopefully over time it'll be something that's really awesome. At least that's my hope. In terms of like new content. So, some people have seen my history videos.
Those
like
are sick.
History of window smoke and that stuff. I plan to kind of do one of those again, but it is a big endeavor. But probably something I'd like to at least do one more before the end of the year. And outside of that, yeah, I'll be around here and there. It's a little difficult I don't show my face as much as I used to, but but if you get me on for an interview like this, it's unlikely I'll say no.
Hell yeah. Maybe another Philly land. Pop out to that too.
Yeah.
See you at that. But yeah, thank you, man. I really appreciate this. Like this was actually, I genuinely appreciate this. Thank you so much.
Yes.
And
Thanks so much as well.
Plug your content. What's Mahone_CS, right?
Underscore TV.
No, bro. I put this whole stream. I had it as Mahone_CS. No way. I'll edit it in. I'll edit it in the video.
Post production,
yeah. We'll be good. We'll be good. Okay. I appreciate it. Everyone else, you have a good rest of your day, and see you guys next time. Peace out.